Chapter 11 Safety. Now you are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The air was filled with the pleasant smell of fresh cut and polished wood. In the end, they had gone with cherry wood for the flooring of their new headquarters. You've got this. As he looked up the large gallery with the simple wood railing, Korko addressed Brym, who had come to the entrance to see them off. All around himself the prince could hear the hammers and saws which put the work into the old construction. The building had belonged to another merchant group, but the business had been run out of the city by the fierce competition. Fortuitous for Korko and his companions, since they were able to buy their new first branch office on the cheap. All it would need was a bit of repairs before they would be ready to open. For a long time now, the carpenters had been working on the showroom up front, but finally, the new main building of the fast-grade merchant company was nearing completion. Yeah, no worries bro, Atao is here as well, so we'll be fine. You can go and pick up your stuff. A short nod of gratitude and Korko turned to leave, both Ronnie the alchemist and his attendant Fidelio in tow. Since the incident in Whiteport, the warrior had rarely ever left the side of his master, worried for his safety. Still, the master wasn't in any way feeling safe, as rude as that might have been to the powerful warrior. The sudden attack in front of Lord Spire Castle had left a deep scar in his mind. The one in his left chest was still there as well, as a constant reminder of his negligence. It was the reason he had decided to order a special item after they had settled down again. Their new headquarters was no longer set in Ballot, but it wasn't very far away. For their new home, the merchants had chosen the old familiar city of Etra. For the second time in as many years, Korko was forced to spend his spring in this place. Though many towns they had seen over the past 4 seasons had been in even worse condition, he still hated the dirty, grimy town with a passion. Still, it was the ideal location to relaunch their business, though not everyone shared Korko's opinion on the issue. This still isn't a great idea, is it? Shouldn't we take distance from the assassins, rather than move in closer and hold out our necks? Ronnie asked as he looked around, worried about an ambush in broad daylight. You're still complaining about that? Etra's perfect for our purpose, in every regard, the Crown Prince replied in a casual manner. It's a free city, which means that there's no lords above us to just take whatever they want. Positioned around it are 3 different lordships, which means that we have our pick for who to trade with and where to get our sugar beets. Etra's domain over the Kulkas River even leads right into the sea, which means we won't have to pay any customs tax so long as we work inside the city's guild system. Plus, we've already bribed all the officials to open shop here. No need to waste all that money. By the time the paint on our first branch office is dried, we'll be all set to go. Yes, perfect. And then Duke Herak can come in and siege the city right beside his lands. We will not be able to operate like this. We are far too close to the flame. Look, the Duke also lost a good man the last time he attacked us. This time, it was Fidelio who answered the alchemist's worries. Now that Herak knows what we can do, he'll be a lot more careful in his actions. It's not only that. Our little stunt with the good Dr. Freegen riled up Whiteport something fierce. Now the Whiteport Lordship has sent half of its giant fleet to put pressure on Borna, all just so they can get their hands on Herak. For a good while, that dude will be far too busy to worry about us. We'll just have to get ourselves established by the time he can catch his breath and the heat dies down. Speaking of heat, we're here. While immersed in their talks, they had reached the noisy, sooty goal of today's trip. Korko entered the solid oaken door, reinforced with cast iron bars, and went into the blacksmith's shop. Welcome, sire, welcome. Together with a gust of intense heat, the frank voice of the shop's owner greeted them. As always, the strong-looking blacksmith had his eyes on the door as he worked the steel in between his tongs. Though only a muffled sound escaped from beneath his leather mask, one could still feel the positive energy he would surround his guests in at all times. The smith put away the glowing iron, before he removed the mask to reveal a full, well-maintained beard. "I assume Sire is here to pick up his order?" asked the large man as he brushed his hands clean on his leather apron. "That's right. There you go, 2 guildern." Already prepared, Korko put the coins on the scratched table at the front of the smithy, the space where customers would be handled. "Please check their veracity." With a frank smile, the smith walked over and swiped the coins away, as he gave a nod to Fidelio and Bombasticus, who had stayed behind at the door. "No need, sire. Of course I would trust the great seer of the lords. If I did not, why else would I do this sort of work?" The smith moved behind a counter to the side, put there to exhibit some of the finer pieces of his work. This sort of advertisement would be considered unusual for a craftsman in the Middle Ages, but considering Etra's special status it wasn't anything strange. After all, the city was essentially run by merchants, so the smith's marketing ideas weren't that surprising to Korko. Soon, the blacksmith's face returned from beneath the counter, a heavy-looking piece of chain mail armor in his hands. With a grand gesture, he slammed the linked rings of iron on the well-worn table. The fact that the furniture didn't buckle under the jangle and clang of the heavy iron spoke much louder of its quality than its superficial blemishes had done. "You should know, sire, I could get in some serious trouble for this sort of work, I really could. We're not supposed to make any more armor, on account of the trouble we made for the Bornish king last time." The man's sneer looked dismissive. Free cities were notorious for their lack of respect towards the lordships, and there were constant power struggles between them. "I never forced you, so you took the work by choice. Why do it if you're so worried?" With a heavy groan, Korko forced the chain mail off the counter. Quadruple chains linked behind one another. At least twice as heavy as an ordinary chain mail. Luckily, Korko had been in diligent training for over a year now, or he would have embarrassed himself. "Of course I wanted to support the wise seer of the lords. We need some good, faithful people in here. Lately, there's too many suspicious strangers. There's this uncanny cult going around in the back alleys, the reverers they call themselves. Keep telling us that the great lords in heaven do not deserve our prayers and respect. Seems like it's been coming out of Borna. By now some of the merchants have been infected by the nonsense as well. I really do not like it. A good, respectable priest like yourself will need some protection in this godless town. I will do my best. You mind if I try the armor right here? That way I won't walk out in the open with it." Before he left and found problems with the product at home, he would much rather try it on first. "Please do. Over there would be fine." Korko nodded and turned fast to leave for a darker corner of the smithy, the one the pious blacksmith had pointed towards. Though he didn't mind the man himself, there might be problems if he stayed and talked some more about religion. Not for a second had Korko believed in the nonsense of the Arcavians, and lying about his core beliefs was absolutely not his style. He felt bad about exposing the blacksmith to danger over a lie, but there was little he could do now that the work was done. If worst came to worse, he would just have to take the man in for protection. As Korko came back with the heavy iron slung over his shoulder, Ronnie and Fidelio, who had been waiting by the door, moved with him, engaged in their own conversation. While the crown prince was embroiled in a war with the heavy armor, an attempt to get it over his head, Fidelio and Ronnie were still discussing the matters of Duke Harak. "Why are you even coming along with us if you're this scared? Aren't you just here to complain?" "Not like we need any extra muscle with me around," Fidelio said. Meanwhile, the warrior stepped up and did his best to help his master get the chain mail over his head. After a slew of groans and sighs, at last, the armor dropped down with a jangle, laying itself heavily onto the crown prince's shoulders. "If you must ask, warrior, I still call Etra my home. However, someone forced the great Bombasticus on a pilgrimage around the world, wasting my time for an entire year. Since such a long time has passed, the rats have taken hold of my shop. Even though there is little to be done about all the tinctures and herbs which have been taken. Which were useless in the first place. After the hard part had been done, Fidelio had put grey robes over Corco's head, which silenced his voice. The armor would be much more efficient if it was hidden. Corco's muffled voice prompted an annoyed look from the great alchemist, who decided to ignore the interjection. Though the tinctures were taken, the still was too large, and did not seem important enough to the unlearned. Hiding the thing inside a wooden frame was pretty smart, right? Corco bragged about his idea as he adjusted his robes. Sure, but an attempt at theft was still made and the still has been thrown to the floor. I will have to ask the local smith to repair a few parts before work can continue. How do I look? As the smithy wouldn't provide them with a mirror, Corco could only rely on the fashion sense of his companions. It's. Fidelio frowned, unsure of how to answer. Being struck by an idea, the warrior unshackled his weapon from his waist and presented the polished axe head as a mirror. Finally, the prince could see his new look. His face had always been a bit round, even though his body was on the slim side. Now, with the added size from the layer of metal, he truly looked. You look overweight. Instead of the warrior servant, the much drunker alchemist answered the prince's question. Corco slapped his robes, in an attempt to measure his new girth. Isn't that good? From today on, I'll be a merchant anyways. Pretty sure merchants are supposed to be fat. As Corco moved towards the door, the smith on the other side of the room gave them a friendly nod. I will be taking care of business and then follow along later, Ronnie said. He still needed those parts fixed if they wanted to make any more brandy in the future. Sure, you can't get your parts any other time. We can wait too. Still worried about one of his own moving by himself, Corco turned to ask his alchemist if he needed assistance. No, there is still much work to be done for you as well as me. I would rather do it now, so long as the Duke is still busy with other matters. His plight will not last much longer. Of course, the tensions between Whiteport and Ballet have been quite severe, but there will be no war. Sooner or later, King Albius will return to his senses and stop wasting money. And once he is freed from the nuisance, there will be nothing left to stop the Duke from wiping us out. By now, Ducal Herak will know just who has been at fault for his recent troubles. After we have killed one of his men, no less. While the frightened alchemist was immersed in his monologue, Corco already had his hand on the door, out into the fresh air of spring. You're not wrong. The Duke will come back with a vengeance. Even if war were to break out, I doubt Whiteport can beat Borna at sea. I've seen the ships of both sides. It won't even be a fight. Corco thought back to Whiteport's massive fleet of rowing boats, and to Borna's sailing ships, to the bronze cannons on board. He'd rather not see Borna become too powerful too quickly. Unfortunately, he couldn't do much to influence the outcome, beyond providing Whiteport with the kind of technology he would never hand over to the Arcavians. So we need to be prepared. Corco interrupted the pessimistic Bombasticus. You want your revenge too, don't you? What we need to do now is establish ourselves here in Etra. Once we supply all the lords of the West with wine and sugar, Herak won't be able to harm us anymore without hurting himself. Only then we'll get the chance to force more mistakes, and achieve our goals. After he had turned to the door again, Corco opened his path into the sunshine outside. Though the illumination of the spring day made even the dirty roads of Etra seem lively and pleasant, the rays failed to brighten Corco's grim face. Not long now, just another year at most. Only then, finally, they could meet their foe as equals. Chapter 12 Business Partners. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Okay, last question. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? With his elbows rested on the dark wood before him, Corco crossed his hands in front of his face. Meanwhile, the young man with the sharp nose on the other side of the desk seemed sufficiently flustered by the gesture. He looked around the room, towards the other men who sat at the enormous table which formed the centerpiece of the company's new conference room. In the end, he must have received some silent encouragement from one of Korko's colleagues, since he managed to calm his erratic breath before he presented his answer in a halting voice. As far as I understand, sire, you wish to hire for apprenticeships and permanent positions. I would expect to still be here in 5 years. Is that not possible? Korko lowered leaned face closer behind his still crossed hands for dramatic effect. Smirk well. Hidden and brows lowered, he gave the young would-be merchant the menacing stare only a boss could have. As the youngster straightened up in his chair, he swallowed dry air, his hands wringing and twisting like eels in a barrel. Suddenly, with a start, the young man jolted in his chair. While he put on the friendliest smile he could muster, Korko had abruptly stood up from his chair. Of course you can, he answered, at last, as he leaned forward to present his hand. You can start tomorrow. Welcome aboard. With a final handshake between the two, the newly hired accountant excused himself and left the room, all while he wiped the sweat off his brow with a cheap rag. At all other times I'm not one to complain, but what purpose does that question even serve? You've been asking that 5-year stuff every single time, and not once have we gotten back more than fear and confusion. You want to make the new hands respect you or something. To his left, Atao looked at the signature their newest employee had left behind while he complained, as he was wont to do. Nah, it's just tradition. Pretty sure you can't do a job interview without asking that question. Must be some universal law or something. Accompanied by his irresponsible answer, the prince took a seat again. How many does that make now? This Barrett is the 3rd new hand we've hired today. Another 6 from the old Fastgrades business days have found their way back as well, even after a full year out to dry. That makes 9. Should be enough for now. We can get some peons from the market or the harbor whenever we got stuff to lug around. Maybe we can hire a few extra apprentices for chores, but that should be the lot. We don't have that much money left in the first place, Atao answered, still immersed in the list of names he held up in his front. It's good that accounting is this far developed in Arcavia. I mean, they'll still have to learn some more advanced maths. As Korko spoke, Fidelio on his right underlined the prince's speech with a groan. His attendant really didn't take to mathematics, so it was something Korko promptly ignored. But at least we don't need to teach anyone about double-entry bookkeeping or archiving. It saves us a lot of time. True. Helps that this is a merchant town in the first place. We'll be hard-pressed to find this many talented people elsewhere, Atao added. How many more are there anyways? All this sitting around is driving me insane. I need to get outside and move my feet, Fidelio complained. This one should have been the last of the lot. I'll go ask. Atao was about to stand up when a knock on the door interrupted his action. He took his hands off the fancy armrests and seated himself once again, as did the crown prince. As soon as everyone was in position, a short, "Come in," prompted the door to open. From outside entered the face of Brym, together with the left half of his torso. The youngster had been doing the receptionist's job, since no one else had been available for the work up until now. Boss, there's a guest here. Sir has come to give his regards, Noel.n. In answer to Korko's short nod, Brym stepped inside the room and opened the door to reveal a slim man in frilly dresswear. With the white-laced shirt and the puffy sleeves, his clothing reminded Korko of a magician from the 90s rather than a merchant. According to the man himself, it was a look he had picked up in his travels up and down the west coast of the continent. Though as his pale, wrinkly skin and the gray streaks in his hair showed, it had been a long time since he had been forced to do any traveling himself. Culbrant de Varder, elected head of Etra's Merchant Guild, hadn't needed to do anything in person for a long time. He had people for that. Culbrant, what a pleasant surprise. Welcome to our little shop. Together with his 2 seated companions, Korko stood up and walked around the table, towards the smiling man. While he stepped over the soft carpet, the prince showed off the subdued style of the room around him with opened arms. The darker tones of brown and red from the expensive woods gave the whole surroundings a certain gravitas, while the scattered plants in the corners did much to inject an underlying lively mood. I am very glad to see such frank welcome, Lord Corco. Though I would hardly call it a little shop. It is a true marvel to see how much could be extracted from the bones of the old Ulver's former shop. After a firm handshake, Corco showed the merchant over to the side, where a suite of upholstered banks awaited the guests around a kitchen table. The short table wasn't a type of furniture people would usually see in Arcavia. Thus, it had been fashioned especially on Corco's instructions, something brought over from their very own Medalla Empire. Since the building itself was so cheap, we ended up with much more to spend on the interior. Been a pretty good deal for us, all in all. Oh, and please stop calling me Lord. I'm not an Arcavian noble. I wouldn't want the wrong people think otherwise and start making trouble. As they walked over to their seats, the guest nodded his head with a practiced smile before he returned to the topic at hand. Still, the cheap price comes at a cost as well, so some caution would be in order. You should be well aware of the strange rumors, sire. No merchant who has been housed within these walls could sustain his business for more than a few years. Beyond that, they ended up bankrupt, or worse, all of them. With a frown, the merchant and the three noble warriors took a seat, while Brym brought a few cups and some light wine. Though Corco enjoyed showing off, brandy might have been a bit much this early in the day. I'm not superstitious, so that's a non-issue, really. In the end, we're gonna take every advantage we can get. Bold and miserly, that's the only way to do business. A good bon mot to live by. I will make note of it. As his smile grew a bit wider and the slightest bit more honest, the merchant moved the conversation forward. How have recruitments been getting on? Fruitfully, Corco said. Your recommendation has really done us a favor. We've gotten 3 highly skilled workers out of nowhere. I would call it mutual help, rather than a favor. With how unpredictable the lordships are around Etra, there is always eager young men looking for work after their old employer has gone belly up. Even more so now with all that tension out at sea. The merchant took up the wine for a taste, but barely wet his lips, if that. Corco had always found Devarder to be a careful, rational man. Exactly the kind of person he could do very good business with. More tension will only be to our advantage. I doubt we'll share their fate anytime soon. Of course not. Not with the exclusive product and reputation you possess, sire, the Lord said as he swung the cheap green glass cup around in his hand. For now, crystal glass was much too expensive for their little operation to stock up on. It was something Corco was determined to change in the future. Not you, Master Devarder, we, the Crown Prince corrected with a raised finger. You should remember our agreement. You handle the transportation of our wares to overseas lordships and in return you get 1/3 of the profits. Though it was something Atau wouldn't stop complaining about, Corco found the deal with the Etra merchant more than beneficial to their cause. In the end, they didn't have their own ship, nor the money to buy one, and it wouldn't be feasible to carry all the supplies over land, past dozens of toll stations and dangerous areas filled with lords and bandits. Plus, cutting in the local despots would give them some much-needed peace of mind. Yes, I recall quite well, Devarder replied. In return, the Great Seer should also not forget that the agreement includes a share in the losses should one of the vessels fail. Since my ships will transport the goods of another trader, I cannot shoulder all the dangers by myself. Long-distance trade is risky by its very nature, even more so down and around the Perillian coast. Yeah, we can agree on that. Ah, this reminds me. I want to get 1 or 2 of my own people onto your ship, to make sure nothing happens to my investment. Though Corco's request and the way he brought it forth could be considered rude, the merchant still smiled just the same as before. A wise choice. It pays to be careful, in matters like this more than in any others. However, my ships don't load passengers, only sailors. I won't let a land rat board my vessels. Then what about a Tao over here? Korko gestured over to his cousin, who had been quietly sipping his wine as he listened in on their conversation. Interested, Devarder turned to measure the tall warrior with his deep-seated eyes. From one moment to the other, the merchant had disappeared. What replaced him were the sharp eyes and sharper voice of a fleet's captain. At least in stature you seem like you can handle yourself. Have you ever been at sea, youngster? I've been on ships since my youth and sailed across 2 of the great oceans. That enough? A Tao replied with a casual look, clearly unhappy with the way he was being assessed. The captain didn't mind his new recruit's attitude. Instead, he was happy at the youngster's usefulness. Good, someone who knows how to handle himself aboard a ship. We would be glad to welcome you. Another tumult from the door stopped the captain's words. As the noise went closer and closer to the door, the 4 seated men looked over with concern. Seconds of tension passed until the heavy door burst open and swung against the wall behind it, producing a loud bang. Revealed was, once again, Brym, who squirmed around as his shoulder was held down by a tall, armored figure from the back. Without remorse, he pushed the much smaller Brym into the room, where he stumbled forward until he was caught by Korko. Big bro, he wouldn't listen. He just burst in. Brym said in a whiny voice. In response, the intruder looked over to the prince as well. Though his eyes could not be seen through the full helmet, his voice still transmitted his contempt. So you must be the so-called Seer Korkapeka fast grade then, the attacker said with the haughty, nasal tone which was so common for the nobles of Arcavia. I come with a message from the great Duke Herak of Balat. He forbids the fast-grade merchants any further mercantile actions near his borders. Otherwise, prepare to feel the bear's fury. Excuse me, sire. Rather than Korko, Devarder stood up to answer the threat. As far as I understand, Etra is not part of the Duke's lordship, no matter how much he wishes for it. I would like to see the Duke try to enforce his will here, on a member of Etra's Merchants' Union. As he spoke, the merchant, armed with nothing but supreme confidence, marched over and stared right into the messenger's covered face. We will see what the future holds, the masked knight said, you have been warned. The Duke had the grace to let you go once before. It is your choice whether or not to tempt your fate. Thus, he turned and left through the open door. Master Fastgrade, what will you do now? After the stranger had left, worry was written all over Devarder's face. Korko was sure the concern was over lost profits, rather than their group's safety, but it didn't matter. With a toothy grin, the merchant prince gave the only possible response. What else? Let's make some cash. Chapter 13 First Major Hall. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As Atao's feet left the gangway and touched down on the wooden planks of Etra's harbor, he took a last look back to the ship which had been his home for the past 2 weeks. On top of the main deck, leaned against the railing, were the colleagues he had shared hardship with throughout that time. Hey big guy, later the boys are gonna go to town together. You sure you're gonna be off by yourself just like that? Bold John said, his crooked ruin of teeth glistening in the sunshine. Yeah, I have to go report to the boss. You're not gonna do anything but get pissed drunk anyways, not until evening at least. I'll see you boys then. A short answer and a playfully dismissive wave of his hand before he was off, finally back on dry land. With a short hop, Atao adjusted the position of the large bag hung over his right shoulder and then made his way inland, past the seagulls, old fishermen and newly built warehouses. Soon, he had reached the city center, still as much of a shithole as it had ever been. Really, for all their advancements in technology, the most impressive part of the Arcavians was their unnatural tolerance for filth. At least at sea there was always a stiff breeze ready to carry away any odors. And when he had to spend the night under deck he was usually so drunk that he fell asleep no matter what stench filled the crew quarters. The Devarder ship's back. Let's go take a look. In front of Atao, 2 boys, excited by the arrival of those who had seen the wide world the children could only dream of, came towards Atao, immersed in their talk. Doesn't this one sail for the new fast-grade merchants too? The taller of the two asked, much less enthusiastic. Yeah, they sailed together, is what De said. Isn't that exciting? Exciting my foot. Father said they're all secret helpers of the lordships. Those people are gonna sell off the whole city to the Bornish if they can get away with it. As he had gotten close enough for his shadow to cover the two youngsters, the boys finally looked up and saw the giant man with the foreign features who came towards them. With his long hair and dark skin, Atao had always been recognizable around these parts, and the large eyes of the boys, together with their sudden stop of all motor functions, told the returnee that they knew him very well. Friendly as he was, the sailor looked at the two, especially the tall one who had given such a nice opinion of him and his own, and gave them a nice smile and a little wink. In panic, the shorter of the two grabbed his friend's sleeve and pulled both of them to the side, down into a back alley. Atao replied with a frank laugh. Brats, he mumbled, before he marched to the final goal of his journey. Soon, he stood in front of the large, three-story building he had helped repair. The giant sign over the entrance told even the most casual onlooker who the owners of the establishment were. With hastening steps, Atao went up to enter the fast-grade merchant company. However, before he had even gone inside, he stopped at a curious sight. To the side of the entrance, within the front yard, he found Fidelio and Ronnie, busy with some strange wooden contraption. As the tall warrior pushed down a lever, a hose at the front, held by the alchemist, sprayed water all over the clean stone floor. What sort of mess did you guys cause this time that Lockie's put you on cleaning duty? The new arrival called towards them. The two turned in confusion and froze for a moment as they saw him, while the stream of water which escaped from the hose in Ronnie's hand slowly lost in strength, until it ceased. Only then did the two men drop their novel equipment and came over to greet the returnee. Who's the one who got sent away 'cause he keeps causing a mess, huh? Accompanied by his snide remark, Fidelio gave his friend one of his smothering bear hugs as a way to welcome him back home. Who else but the great Atao Sanko Sakardu could ever be trusted with a burden this big? Meanwhile, you're sitting here watering the stones. Atao answered back while a sly grin deformed his scraggly beard, unkempt after weeks on turbulent waters. It isn't watering, you ignoramus. As self-important as always, Bombasticus chimed in. It is the early stages of what Sir Corco called. The alchemist looked around the yard, in search of his words. Firefighting, Fidelio helped out. Ah yes, indeed, Ronnie concurred. Firefighting. So this is another one of Lockie's strange inventions then. Atao's question was met by a dismissive look from the self-styled alchemist. Since the returnee was already getting annoyed, he decided to just make his way inside. Fidelio went back to clear away the equipment, but of course the annoying fly would keep running after the sailor. Showing off his wisdom and culture seemed to be his only goals in life. It is not an invention, merely a tank of water with a simple pumping mechanism. Even an unlearned should be able to understand as much. Still, the pump will be a necessary piece of equipment. Though the building was exceedingly cheap for its size, it is unfortunate that it would be made entirely from wood. In case of a large-scale fire, we could lose everything. Mentally checked out, Atao stepped into the showroom and walked up to the reception. He remembered the man who welcomed him there. It was someone he had seen during the job interviews, though for the life of him he couldn't put a name to the face. Still, it wasn't as if he needed to know the name of every single subordinate. This wasn't a ship, after all. No one's life was dependent on clear and fast orders. Where's the boss? Atao asked. Ah, welcome home, sire. The boss and young master are in the back storage, right through the back door. Armed with a friendly smile, the servant pointed towards the back of the showroom, an area the visitors would have no access to. Luckily, Atao was no visitor, so he continued on. Throughout the interruption, the alchemist had looked between the sailor and the servant, eager to butt in at a moment's notice. Finally, the pesky Ronnie found an opening and continued his explanation. Since fire is such a threat, we need to be prepared. This is what the water pump is for. It will protect us in case a fire breaks out. On top of that, we will be able to sell our services for good money. It is called insurance. That's so. Though he didn't look over even once, Atao could almost see the alchemist's raised chest as he bragged about an idea which surely wasn't his own. Meanwhile, the returnee made his way through the backyard, over to the row of storage rooms, which had been left empty when he had left Etra. After all, the brandy was much too precious to store outside of the main building. Yes, that is indeed so. Other merchants and craftsmen will pay us a fee, in advance. If a house has paid and catches fire within the following 10 days, our firefighters will come to save their possessions. Is this not a brilliant plan? The company can get money from doing absolutely nothing at all. At last, after he had suffered through so much jabber from his companion, Atao spotted the ones he had been looking for all this time. Just as he was closing in, unsure about which of the 3 storage rooms to search first, Korko and Brym left the central building. "Boss, kid." With his sea bag still shouldered, the sailor raised his free arm to greet his cousin and the brat he came along with. As he closed up the door he had just left, Korko turned to look for the source of the noise. A genuine smile shot onto his face as soon as he saw his cousin had come home. At least one of them knew how to react with proper decorum. "Cousin. Finally you're back. We were all worried," Korko said. Though Atao didn't doubt the words, it made the insincere greeting from the others, especially from the alchemist, even more annoying. "Thanks, I'm glad to be home," he said as he hugged his cousin. "Welcome back, bro. How was Whiteport?" Brym added as he received his own hug, a burning lantern held far away from his body all the while. "Was pretty nice. After a week on a ship almost every place looks good though." He halted for a moment as he scanned their surroundings. "Is there any more private place we can talk?" "Sure," Korko said with a grin, "I wanna show you this anyways. Come on in." And so, the prince once again opened the door he had just locked and led them inside. In order to dispel the darkness in the room, Brym raised his lantern to reveal sealed pots of clay, over and over, lined up on shelves along the walls. "It's our newest product. What do you think?" Korko asked with expectation written all over his face. "It's pots. Not the pots of course, the contents. Inside you'll find delicious pickled beets. Took us all day to fill these up." With an unbelieving look, Atao observed his cousin, in search for the punch line. "Like the stuff we ate back in Enila. I mean, it was good, but I wouldn't pay a lot of money for the stuff." "Why not? Good seasoning, it's healthy and lasts an eternity. But in all seriousness, the whole thing's just a cover-up anyhow." "Cover up?" Atao raised a brow at the strange term. "It's a way for us to disguise the source of our sugar. If others find out that we can make it just by boiling beets in water, everyone will start growing these, and then the sugar will be worth nothing." Brym explained with an enthusiasm and animation which made erratic shadows dance along the walls of the storage. "So if these are just deception then where's the sugar?" Atao asked as he searched around the dim room with his eyes. "Underground. We can't sell that stuff for now, not until we can explain where it comes from. That's where you come in. Only if you make a sufficiently long journey as the captain of our own ship can we pretend to have bought the sugar from some distant kingdom overseas. Otherwise we'll be in trouble as soon as we start selling. Everyone is gonna pressure us to release the secret formula, and unlike with the brandy, we won't have the lords to use as protection." Korko explained the entirety of his sugar-selling ploy. Though Atao understood that they had to be careful of competition, it sure sounded far too convoluted for his tastes. What a waste, the so far silent Ronnie chimed in, it will take years until we can start selling all that precious sugar. None of this would happen if Prince Korko was finally willing to build some of the true treasures I have heard about. Telescopes, flintlock rifles, fertilizer, adding machines. Even a simpleton can see how much worth these products would have. All we need to do is... No. The alchemist's words were cut short by Korko's stern reply. I'm not gonna reveal any core technology in Arcavia. I will not help develop countries which could become my enemies in the future. All they get is booze and sugar. They can puzzle the rest together by themselves. Atao looked between the two, as they were locked in a staring contest. This wasn't the first time Korko had shown a sensitive reaction over the topic. Though Atao himself didn't think it was a big deal, for Korko this core technology issue seemed really important. Still, there was no way he would go through a pointless argument on his first day back home. Luckily, he had brought with him the perfect way to dissolve the conflict. Okay, break it up, boys. Ronnie, you think we'll have money trouble if we won't sell the sugar for a while? If you really think so, then look at this. As he was talking, Atao swung the sailor's bag off his shoulder and untied the rope at the top. With his last words, he turned the bag to pour the contents on the earthen ground. Under countless clinking sounds, a waterfall of glittering metal gushed out of their container. Soon, a small yellow mound had formed in front of Atao's feet. Gold, the out-of-breath alchemist asked in disbelief. Guilderns. Korko replied, as he picked up some of the cold metal and rubbed it between his fingers. It's just a fraction of our haul. I did just as you said, lackeys, and the operation was a rousing success. Every lordship we went, I brought all the kings and dukes and what have you, a free bottle of our finest. All we had to do was wait until the news spread. Then the other nobles were ready to sell off their wives and daughters to partake in the drink of the lords. Crazy how desperate these guys were for the stuff. All in all, after Devarder took his part, our share comes down to a bit under 50,000 guilderns. No matter how much money we might make from anything else, the brandy alone is more than enough to make us some of the richest men on Arcavia. You thought it would take us years to get our own ship. Heck, we can buy one now. From today on, it's only up for us. Chapter 14 Inventions. You are listening at novelfull.audio. So, how's it look? Korko asked his apprentice as he wiped the sweat off his brow. I'm not sure. Addressed by his big brother, Brym put down the leather tube in his hand. Only after some hesitation did he answer the question. What do you mean you're not sure? Can you see or not? With a frown, the crown prince stood up from his workstation and walked over to his ward. All the while, he cleaned his hands with the same rag he had used for his brow before. It looks a bit crooked. Careful, determined not to disappoint Korko, the short merchant boy tried to hide the tube away from him by taking it behind his back. Let me see. Annoyed, Korko went around and snatched the instrument without much effort. Brym's training had been going pretty well, but the kid had only been a cultivator for a year and a half now. Plus, he was still a brat, not even 15 years old. Once the crown prince had seized the telescope, he gave the instrument an inspection of his own. A look through revealed the other side of the large warehouse, a place they had transformed into their testing area. Through the rays of sunlight from the glass windows and the dancing flecks of sawdust, his view fell onto their other inventions on the other side of the hall. Sandpaper, rulers, spirit levels. All simple little inventions, most only a means to an end. The telescope was supposed to have been one such end, but the results were disappointing. Although the view was enlarged as desired, the image was completely distorted on the left. Ah, crap. What went wrong? In the end, he was just as disappointed as Brym had feared. How much time did we spend getting these lenses polished right? They worked perfectly before we put them inside, didn't they? As he stomped up and down the hall, he thought for a bit, before he turned back over to Brym, just to get some confirmation. They were. Maybe the lenses moved when we put them in. Something must not be aligned right. Well, shit. An awkward silence fell over the two, as Korko tried his best to find a shortcut out of his dilemma. In the end, there was none to be found, so with a sigh, the prince turned over to his workstation and sat down once again. He grabbed a knife and began to take apart the string which held the thick leather together. Without another word, Korko had gotten back to work again. Brym, meanwhile, sat down to Korko's side. Knees on his stool, the apprentice swayed back and forth, with his forearms leaned on the table. Why don't we just get a leatherer or a tailor to do this for us? I mean, you can do so much, bro, but in the end you're no expert. Careful, Brym brought forth the idea he had been having for a good while now. Korko, focused on his task, reacted much calmer than the boy had expected. Nope. Not gonna happen. We've already had to get these lenses specially made in Whiteport, since there's no one else making clear glass, at least not in Arcavia. Having them make just the lenses alone is already the limit of what I can endure. I'm not handing the secrets to one of the great navigational tools over to some random tailor. At last, Korko's efforts paid off and the strings came apart. As the leather opened, it revealed the felt dot covered inside, on which the two glass lenses soon dropped. The imprints in the felt showed clearly that one of the lenses had set at an angle, the cause of their troubles. There you go, that would be the problem, huh? Korko mumbled, I thought we had it all measured out. How did this even happen? I just meant. Since cousin will be back soon, we need to get this done. Once he comes back from his trip our ship will be ready, Brym said with worry. He was right, so Korko decided to look up from his work and properly face the issue. For now, we still have some time. Their ship is gonna lead them past the southern coast all the way around the continent. It's the farthest they've ever gone, and I've even convinced Devarder that he'll get a good position to train him up as a captain. Devarder has no problem with us taking over his business. I mean, once we start our own fleet he'll be cut out of the deal, won't he? Nah, not a problem. We've agreed on shares. With great care, Korko put the glass lenses to the side. These things were expensive, so he would rather not waste any more of them. Ah, so he bought a piece of our new ship? Brym asked. After almost 2 years of schooling, the kid had begun to understand some more modern concepts like shares, at least when it came to money-making. Yup. He'll pay for a third of the ship's cost. A third of the running costs too. The Ultima really liked the idea, obviously. Makes sense. You can spread your assets over a larger fleet and make the same amount, but at the same time you minimize the chance of a total loss if one ship sinks. Really a smart plan, that is. Brym raved. However, only a moment later he became serious again, reminded of the ship which was being fitted in Etrasport. Still, how will cousin sail if he doesn't get the equipment in time? We got the compass done, but what about that? Sextant, was it? With another frown, Korko looked down onto the gutted telescope. We're not gonna get a sextant made, not anytime soon. For that, we'd need a precision we just can't manage at the moment. The telescope might be our limit for now. Then we should get proper craftsmen after all. We're not talking about this again. Korko replied with a stern voice as he bent down under the table. Somewhere down here he had stored the rest of the felted leather. Should be more than enough for some more trial and error. We'll get this done ourselves, even if it costs us some extra materials. That's still better than giving the Bornish the navigation tools they'll need to sail to the Medalla Empire. I won't have my country invaded with my own tools. Though Bornish merchants had already reached Medalla's shores even before his exile, for now their journey was long and dangerous. There was no reason to make their lives easier. In reaction to Korko's rebuke, Brym lowered his head. All that precious glass, he mumbled, before he headed under the table as well to help Korko look for that leather. It's not like the tools are needed in the first place. Atao has been at sea since he was little and our new ship has a fantastic, modern design. Would be nice if we could get these done by then. But even if we can't, it still won't be the end of the world. Found it, through the mess under the table, Brym's happy voice called out. Korko got up, careful not to bump his head into the table, not again. Once his view was clear, he saw Brym stand before him with a big smile on his face and a long piece of leather hanging down his arm. Just as the prince was about to take the material for another attempt at leather work, he heard a bang from the large front door, followed by shouts and curses. "What's going on?" Brym asked as he turned around. "Let's find out." With a frown, the prince moved past the kid, ready to find out who would dare make such a ruckus on their property. He really didn't like noise while he was working. His people should have known that already, so the remaining options all spelled trouble. On his way over to the large gate of the warehouse, he picked up his axe and a matchlock pistol he had bought only 2 weeks before. As he took a knee by the door and filled the pistol with powder, the noise outside rose to greater and greater heights. In utter confusion, multiple voices were shouting over each other, all the while closing in on their position. "Big bro," a worried Brym said. "It's fine. You stay inside. I'll handle this." With a nod, Brym disappeared back into the depths of the warehouse, where he proceeded to pick up several blankets to cover all the inventions they had made over the past few weeks. Nice of him to think ahead like that. Relieved that the equipment would be safe with the kid for now, Korko finished his own preparation. With the help of a candle by the side, Korko lit the loot of his matchlock pistol and cocked the hammer. Ready to fire. Pistol raised to make sure none of the ammo would drop out, Korko shoved the door open with his shoulder to scout the outside. Sunlight blinded him the second he left the room, but he could still see his own men, hired helpers from outside the city, as they held off a group of shadows in his front from storming him before he could get his bearings. With squinted eyes, the prince did his best to identify the attackers. Finally, the shadows turned back into people, most ordinary people at that. Unlike what Korko had believed, the attack wasn't another assault from the Duke or a criminal organization, here to demand a cut of his profits. Instead, the crowd consisted of mostly children, with a few women and older men mixed in. The angry mob spat and cursed in his direction, held back by the wide arms of Korko's workers. Still, they were no more than a dozen, and wouldn't be much of a threat. Since he wouldn't need the pistol any longer, the prince was free to resolve the conflict quickly. With a bang, the gunpowder ignited and fired the loaded lead ball into the cloudless sky. The dangerous noise of gunfire was something the people of Etra had become well familiar with over the years, so the single action was enough to end the uproar. With a frown on his face, Korko lowered the pistol and stepped forward, closer to the crowd. "What is going on here?" The prince looked over the crowd, no one willing to meet his gaze. "Traitor!" someone shouted from the back. Soon, the entire mob was riled up again. "Heathen! Slaver! Shut the fuck up!" Korko enunciated each word as he pointed the gun towards the rambling masses. Though the weapon had been fired empty, he still achieved his desired effect. Once again, quiet returned to the front yard of the Fastgrades Harbor warehouse. Unconcerned by their numbers, Korko stepped forward, past his men and through the crowd, until he reached in front of a haggard youngster with dirty hair. "You were the one who called me a traitor first, weren't you? You're not gonna stay hidden in a small crowd like this. You'd need more people." The prince accompanied his advice with a friendly smile. "So what?" the young man answered with clenched jaws. Though his face looked determined, he began to step back as Korko closed in. "It's true anyways. Everyone in the city is a reverer, or soon enough they'll be. You're the seer, or so you say. The mouthpiece of the lordships, impious filth, here to take our freedom." Despite the man's slander, Korko still retained his smile. He wouldn't play games today. As the rabble-rouser stepped back, away from Korko, the prince followed along, until the attacker's back had hit the door of the warehouse all the way across the street. "You want to silence me, but you can't silence the truth," the sweating man shrieked. "Your name is Olek, right? I know you, you're a worker over at Trelban's company." Rather than answer, the man just stared at Korko again, so the prince turned the questioning into a monologue. "You're here, the employee of a competitor, and you would slander me, and willingly put all these people here in danger, just so your boss can make some extra coin. Now who lacks proper piety?" Finally, the murmurs in his back started up again, but this time they were confused rather than angry. "Nonsense. Where's the danger in teaching a traitor a lesson? You're trespassing on a member of the merchants' unions, private property. According to Etra's laws, I could have shot everyone here dead, that includes you, and I would have received not even a slap on the wrist. Though of course, at that point Tralban could make trouble for me at the next union meeting, which seems to have been the goal. The only reason this didn't turn into a bloodbath is because I'm in a good mood from today's lovely weather. So how about you scram and tell your boss? Next time he tries something like this, he can look for a new errand boy. Understood, friend." Korko watched as the idiot pawn who had been sacrificed by his boss stumbled over his own feet while he rushed back into the city. Slowly, the prince's smile transformed into a deep frown. This time the conflict had been cleared up, but this sort of trouble would continue. By now, the fast-grade merchants were too big a target, and with the spread of the new faith, there were more than enough excuses to accuse him. If they wanted to deal with the increasing problems, they'd have to hire some extra muscle. Korko thought of Atao, on his last trip on a foreign vessel. Right now, he would be trapped on a ship manned by nothing but revirers. He just hoped his cousin would make it home safe. Chapter 15 Matters of Faith. You are listening at novelfull.audio. White on red on blue, the rugged, ice-covered cliffs along the Astarian coast resisted, with great bravery, the attempts at conquest from the freezing sea. Though in truth, the so-called sea would just be part of one giant ocean, according to what Lokis had taught them. Still, the war between waves and land was a spectacle Atao never grew tired of. "Ah crap. You feelin' homesick again, Footlicker?" On the other hand, many things could change in an instant, as he found out on this trip. Atao turned around and looked at old John, the deckhand who had spent so much time on this ship. In a way, the old man had been his mentor, had taken him in and shown him the ropes when he had started out as a sailor. Back then, John had only ever laughed and smiled his crooked smile as he taught Atao about all the quirks of the ship. And of course about all the superstitions any good sailor would need to know. "Just looking out onto the waves, old John. You don't think it's impressive?" Rather than answer, rather than show his smile and tell another tale of kobolds and gremlins hiding in the waters, the oldie simply spat past Atao, out into the sea, before he turned to return to his mates. Yes, some things truly changed. Once they were changed, they could never be brought back, lost irredeemably. With a frown, Atao looked at the men who had been his comrades before, at the men he had shared hardship with on 4 different trips before this one. Since he had been picked as first mate to the captain, things had become dramatically different. No longer was he welcome in their quarters, no longer was he forced to drink along or be part of their songs. However, it wasn't because the men hated the authority of the ship's hierarchy. Rules were rules, and nowhere would rules be more important than at high seas. Even though he would only be first mate for this one trip, to prepare Atao for his own ship which would be waiting back home in Etra, the rest of the crew felt that he had used his connections to get ahead of them, and that he didn't deserve his position. If he wanted to hold the crew together and finish his final journey with them in a peaceful manner, Atao needed to do something. Soon, they would reach the Cape of Tears, the most difficult part of their journey around the south coast of Arcavia. Thus, he decided to move towards the men, try one last time to turn back the clock and sit with them like before. Pretending confidence, Atau walked over to the circle of sailors as they drank their weak beer. Over the stiff breeze being caught in the sails and the creaking ropes he could hear their talks. Guess that's the great lords for ya. All they'll do is use the good Lord Arcavus to keep us down. Polder, brave, hard-working and stupid, said before he took a swig of beer. Not all of them are bad. The Bornish have been talking conversion too, you know. Rallo, the new cabin boy, replied. Polder waved his free hand in dismissal. A lord being a reverer. Won't he get done in by his own? Nah, they just understand the truth. That the great Arcavus is there for all us folk. You didn't hear what the priests are saying. In the end, we're all children of Arcavus. No word in the Halician that we need to pay for new temples just so those guys take us along to their afterlife. This time, it was old John's turn to answer. Ah, so what? They're the ones with the most blades. Nothing to be done. So what if they're in charge? We're the ones doing all the work, so why do they get to live in the castle? And even with all that, they still want to get at our coin so they can build a fancy crypt. You're not wrong. Atau had been closing in slowly, and finally old John had provided him with the ideal point to jump in on the conversation. What do you want, footlicker? After talking our work you want to take our fun too. We're not allowed to speak our minds off duty now. As an experienced sailor, Polder would know as well as anyone here that there was no off-duty atop a sailing ship. Still, Atau ignored the cheap provocation. He wouldn't let the conversation get derailed here. I'm just saying, the ones in charge have no God-given right to rule over anyone. That's all just bullshit made up to make the common folk easier to control. The crap does that mean? You trying to say that the lords are all fake? Weren't you and your boss their slavers? Just because we sell them wine. Why would that mean we're working for the lords, Polder? In the end it's just us making exorbitant amounts of coin from the lords of Arcavia. All that money flows into Etra, to pay carpenters, bricklayers, masons, and whatever else we need to build all those offices, warehouses and ships. We're redistributing the wealth from the ones at the top back to the ordinary people. Wide-eyed, Polder stared at Atau. So, you don't work with the priests in Arcava or their first son? All men in the circle spat on the ground in unison upon hearing of the filthy title. With a smile, Atau thought back to what his cousin had to say on the matter. You know how the Arcavian religion came to be. Back some 800 years ago, the great Arcavus had just ascended to godhood and left his sons with his territory, all that land splintered between his children. So the sons, in order to hold power, told everyone that Daddy had gone to heaven to kill the old gods and that now, he was in charge. He wasn't. Rallo asked with wide eyes. Polder slapped his arm to shut the kid up before he asked his own question with a frown. Now how would you know? I'm friends with the seer, you know. Atau replied. I'm not saying Arcavus hasn't ascended. Though he didn't believe a word of the Arcavian drivel, Atau found it better to be diplomatic here. But his sons also claim this. Only descendants of the great Arcavus could ever rule. No one else should even try. By now, how many gods do we have, huh? All those little lords, becoming saints and gods for having their soldiers kill the soldiers of some other little lord. What did those great rulers even do in those fights? As Atau looked around the circle, he found the men who would not even look at his face before were now glued to his lips. Self-satisfied he continued, secure in the knowledge that he was on the right track. The truth is, the lords didn't do anything. I mean, think about it. How did Arcavus become the great god? Easy, by being the greatest, mightiest conqueror who ever lived. In comparison, what did his descendants do to become gods? Being born. Doesn't that seem strange to anyone? Now think about me and my cousin, the seer as you call him. Think about our story you've heard in the taverns. How could it be that a common merchant like the old Fastgrade could speak to the gods and learn how to make the gods drink? Simple. He achieved a lot in his life. Some of you should know the old Fastgrade. Anyone know what kind of guy he was? One man raised his hand. Toldo, a Tau remembered. Yeah, I've been on his ship a couple years ago. A good guy that one was. Proper gentleman. Not like our misers over in Etra. Exactly. The old Fastgrade worked his way from the bottom all the way to a fortune. So how do you reach this close to Arcavis, learn secrets like how to make brandy? By being successful and by being kind. I mean, Arcavis himself wasn't descended from any gods and achieved all his greatness by himself. Why would the rules change for the sons? That's right. Isn't the other stuff a trick to hold us common folk down then? Satisfied, Atau looked over the riled-up crowd. Even though it had all been improvised, he was sure that his ideas would change their opinions on him. After all, he was no longer the enemy. The enemy were the lords. According to Laches, the best way to unite was always through a common enemy. In the end, I'm as much common folk as anyone here. So how about we all work together from now on? Together, we'll get over to Anila, pull some gold from the pockets of the masters and take it back to Etra. You guys with me? Before Atau had even finished his speech, Rallo had started to nod with enthusiasm. Soon enough, all the other men joined in as well. Even the old John, who hadn't said a single word beyond the initial insult, seemed deep in thought as he considered Atau's words before he nodded with the rest, his eyes cast down into his beer. Atau himself believed that he had solved the biggest problem of their journey. Surely, now the men had understood what was at stake here. Now, the men had realized that they would have to work together, that a rift could destroy the fleet. Satisfied, the first mate went back down the stern of the ship, to the captain's quarters. Since the troubles on deck had been resolved as they neared the most dangerous part of their journey, he would have to inform the captain of the good news. However, Atau did not understand just what sort of storm his careless words would unleash, both atop the ship and across Arcavia, and finally all across the world. Underscore 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 night had fallen over the freezing sea and most men lay in their quarters. However, hidden in a corner of the lower deck, darker than anywhere else, two men concocted a plan. What do you think about that stuff? The big one said, Old John. Polder asked. Makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, he's still a bastard for skipping ahead in rank, and it still means luck, but at least on Arcavis he should be right, shouldn't he? So what does that mean for us then? Scratching his head, Polder continued his questions. He was probably curious about the reason for their secret meeting. If anything, it means that we're not doing too well. Huh, what do you mean, John? Think, brat. If your post in heaven above comes down to how well you're doing down here, then aren't we all losing, the whole crew? Ha! Old John sighed. Despite his betrayal, that was one thing the big bastard had over Polder at least. Atau was a pretty smart one. Still, John would have to work with what he had. Listen up, you get to sit with the gods if you do well for yourself, right? Even become a god. Yeah. So what have we done with our lives? Sailed around a bit and blown all our coin on Horan and Buzen. What do we have to show when our time comes? We're as poor as we were when we saw our first sail. So if a great merchant like Fastgrade gets to sit with the lords, where do you reckon we get to sit? Under deck, eatin' hard tack, that's where. Finally, the dullard understood the meaning behind John's words. His eyes darted around in panic, searching for an way out of his miserable life, a way to make up for his faults and eat with the gods. In the end, his gaze returned to old John, the one who always had the answers. What do we do then? Polder asked with a quiver in his voice. Ain't that easy? Suddenly, a grin returned to old John's face. He looked over his shoulder, to make sure no one would listen in. We just gotta take over the ship. What? Shoo. With warning eyes, old John put a finger over his mouth to shut up the dimwit. You wanna get us keelhauled? Panicked and confused again, Polder looked around before bent down towards old John and answered in a whisper. Isn't that bad? Even I know you're not supposed to do that. Why not? Didn't the big one say it too? You work hard all day and the ones to profit are only the Lord's. Well, like this, aren't we working hard? You bet your ass we are. So where's our money then? The merchant bosses get fat and fatter and we have to sit in this stinkin' cabin till our teeth rot off, he said as he pointed at the few crooked teeth he had left. Nah, we'll just do what the seer did. Take from the rich and give it to the poor. We'll make sure every man on the ship gets to the afterlife a rich man, that way everyone gets to sit on that table. But isn't that dangerous? We're not gonna win over the men for this sort of thing, not enough to beat the captain, at least. Why not? They hate the big one already for stealing March and almost half the crew are proper reverers like ourselves. All we gotta do is collect them together, quiet. Like. Then we wait till the Cape of Tears. Over there, the captain is gonna be too busy steerin' the ship to care for us. We'll strike then. They'll never seen it comin'. Still don't think we should be doing this. Didn't you want your own ship? Well, this one might be your only shot. We're not gonna get another mutiny done. With all the trouble this time, De Varder's gonna clean up all the reverers on deck when we get home. You know that's true. As he dreamed of the riches which awaited him, Polder's frown transformed into a smile. All right, I'm in. Even though old John felt bad for leading the young man into danger, he would suppress his guilt. In the end, Polder was still young and had much time left to achieve his goals, but getting there early would still be good. What John did wasn't wrong, and he himself didn't have many years left. He needed to do something with his life, now, before he ended up at the foot of the table. On that he would insist, even if he had to sacrifice a few deckhands to do so. Chapter 16. Pray you are listening at novelfull.audio. Damn it, which one of you numbskulls didn't put their stuff below deck? Animated by the oncoming storm, buckets, brooms and brushes tumbled all across the ship's forecastle. At the same time, the howling winds, blowing through the overhead rigging with worrying force, threatened to swallow Atau's voice, just like the seas threatened to swallow their entire ship. Although he was right at the heart of the problem, right atop the forecastle, it was a surprise that the sailors at fault for the mess could hear him at all. Luckily, the cultivator was large, and could elicit a volume to match his size. Thus, the men looked over as their first mate walked up the stairs with annoyance chiseled deep into his face. They didn't need this kind of trouble, not now. What are you doing, you bastards? Stop standing around and get to work. Though at first some attempted to step up, not convinced by Atau's authority, it took only one look at their first mate for them to shrink away. Though Atau wasn't a monster like Fidelio, he was still massive compared to ordinary men. So they bent in submission. With their bodies lowered, the sailors were in prime position to clean up the hazards they had so carelessly left on deck. As the slack-offs got to work, Atau looked out to the ships, the Delalia's bow, while he leaned on the railing. Dnov the blue water had turned to white before them as the waves crashed against the submerged cliffs. Here, the two major streams of southern Arcavia would clash under the watchful eyes of ragged cliffs. Unpredictable weather, raging oceans, invisible reefs made of the hardest rock. The most dangerous place in the world. The Cape of Tears. Worried, Atau observed the chaos as best as he could. Rocking and swaying like a punch-drunk fighter yet unperturbed, their ship pressed on, up to the gates of the underworld, ready to face the destiny the world would present them. He really didn't like being trapped here. Atau would have preferred to be at his proper place, atop the quarterdeck, under the captain's instructions. Over there he could have seen how a real sailor would use all his experience to navigate his way through the colossal dangers ahead. Instead, the numbskulls behind him had forced Atau to come all the way to the ship's bow, just so they would do their jobs. In the end, the first mate wasn't only worried about their course. Over the past few days, the previous signs of insubordination had disappeared without a trace, so their return at the most critical point in their journey didn't bode well for any of them. The sliding equipment had been hard to overlook, so clearly, they had refused to do their duties before their first mate had shown up, almost as if it had been done on purpose. Big guy. As his worries mounted like the dark clouds did over his head, a terrified voice ripped the first mate out of his thoughts. He turned to find one of the men close in on him, crouched down in a widened stance. The knife in his hand glittered in a dangerous light. Atau's eyes ripped open, from shock and anger, as the exposed sailor rushed over to finish the deed. Wrong choice, buddy, the captain held on to the railing with his left as he bent his knees. Though the man's rush was ferocious, the unstable ship made his charge wild, uncontrolled. Keeping his balance with the railing's help, Atau slipped his right arm under the sailor's knife hand and pressed it up, high over the attacker's head. For a short second, the two fighters stood opposed, face to face. In the man's eyes, Atau could read a unique mix of fear, rage and determination. However, he wouldn't care about the thoughts of a traitor. A short slip of his waist and a quick grab and pull of his right hand were enough to help the hapless attacker's momentum. With a scream, he sailed over the railing and into the roiling waters below. One down, Atau barely took note of the desperation in the dead man's eyes before he turned to face the rest. Built up in a semi-dot circle around himself stood another 4 men. In the back, a fifth held on to Rallo, the cabin boy who had warned Atau of his impending doom. Though they held knives and sabers in their hands, they seemed unwilling to come closer for now, afraid to be the next man jumping ship early. With a further deepening frown, Atau looked past the attackers, to find the entire ship sunken into chaos, to reflect the stormy sea around them. All across the main deck, fights and tussles had broken out between the sailors. Who was fighting whom, and why, was all but impossible to tell, but Atau still knew what was going on. So, who's been planning a mutiny? He sneered as he asked the surrounding sailors. Not a sliver of fear was present in his voice. In the end, they were just mortals, and he himself a mighty warrior. Shouldn't have been so greedy, footlicker. Shoulda let someone else move up, one of them answered. Toldo, Atau remembered. He had always gotten along quite well with the simple sailor, even after most of the reverers on board had turned against their new first mate. That's it. That's the reason. Disbelief tinged Atau's voice, but no surprise. In war, there was no place for emotion. That not enough for ya? Toldo showed his yellowed teeth as he lowered his stance. Just as Atau was about to answer, the first mate could feel something bump into his right boot. A quick look down revealed the same bucket he had seen before. Behind his back, the bastards hadn't even pretended to work. Somehow, this was far worse to Atau than their actual betrayal. He decided to beat it into them, both the loyalty and the work ethic. First he steadied his stance again. Falling to the ground now would be akin to a bull losing his feet in front of hyenas. Once his footing was secured, Atau bent down, slowly, and picked up the bucket. Solid oak, reinforced with iron. Not a great weapon, but it would do. Nah, it's enough, he answered Toldo's question. Let's get to work. With the final words spoken, the first mate of the Dalalia had gone and left behind the great warrior of Medalla. With his body lowered like a puma on the prowl, Atau rushed towards the attackers. It was a bad position for normal combat, since height would bring all sorts of benefits, but on deck, a low point of gravity, and with it a good balance, would be more important than reach or angle. Asterisk first goal, the left one. Easy target, asterisk the quivering sailor stood there with his rusty knife, off to the side, clearly the weakest of the group. Stunned, the sailors just watched on as Atao closed in on them without fear. With both hands, the lone cub held out his knife to fend off the beast. It would be in vain. Atao swatted the limp arms away with a single swing of his bucket before his massive frame tackled the skinny sailor to the planks under a splash of water. A sharp clink over the howling storm told Atao that the knife had fallen. Still, he'd have to act fast before reinforcements could arrive. No time for compassion, no, please. As the downed opponent's hands stretched towards Atao, mounted on the sailor's body, he begged for his life. It proved a poor choice. The bucket came down, past his hands and square into his face. As the improvised weapon lifted up once again, the bloody mess was only visible for the fraction of a second before the hardened wood smashed down again. Only visible between strikes, the damage increased like a picture book of horrors. Still, the warrior kept pounding. Shoulda kept his hands close to the body. Gotta cover up first, the warrior thought as he finished his work. Finally, he turned to look to the remaining men. 2 of the leftover 4 were locked in place, shocked by Atao's ferocity. Toldo, meanwhile, had proven himself a worthy man and attempted to close the distance to the one-sided battle. However, all he had managed in the few seconds of one-sided slaughter had been to slip around on the wet, swaying ship. As his eyes met Atao's, even he stopped. His blood calmed by the chilling gaze of the beast, Toldo shuffled back to his comrades, to seek strength in numbers. The warrior looked around himself, but the dead brat's knife must have slipped away somewhere on the fresh-cleaned floorboards. Doesn't matter. This one's still good, he raised his bloodied bucket together with his body, red chunks of skin and bone falling off both in the process. The 3 men made another step backwards, another step closer together. Idiots. You can't fight in a formation this tight, just as the warrior was about to teach the sailors another lesson in warfare, a shrill voice interrupted his plans. Stop. One more step and your precious brat gets it. The last of the men was the one Atao had taken the least notice of. All this time, he had been in the back of the group, so the warrior had ignored him to focus on the more immediate threats. However, now he pushed ahead, with Rallo held in his front and a saber's blade at the boy's throat. If you don't want the traitor to die, you best drop that bucket over there. Mistaking the warrior's reassessment for hesitation, the sailor's voice gained strength. Surely, he saw himself as the winner already. He must have imagined how the soft and friendly first mate would give up his weapon to talk him down from his folly. Kid. However, Atao knew better. No good end would await them if he gave up now. It would only produce 2 corpses instead of 1. Thus, he looked at the boy, wide-eyed and panicked as he was, and spoke, in a deep, solemn voice. You're a brave one, a real man. If you won't find reward in this life, I hope you will in the next. Atao lowered his stance again, ready to jump the heinous attacker, ready to risk the boy's life to stop the mutineers, when a dull crash stopped him again. A crash and the ship slowed down to veer left, as all of them were thrown across the deck. Within the confusion of battle, they had run on a reef. Atao had no idea how bad the damage would be, but for the moment he had more important things to worry about. A hand pressed into the watery film of the wooden boards, the warrior jumped back up, with a dexterity far beyond a man his size. Then, before anyone could act, he ran back over to the hostage-taker. He would free the brave boy who had saved his life, and repay the debt he owed. Halfway there, his body was upright enough to assess the situation, and what he saw was a tragedy. The traitorous sailor was kneeling over Rallo's body, blood all over his hands, while the bloody saber slid across the planks in his front. At his feet lay Rallo, still wide-eyed, still looking scared, but the life had gone and left him. With shivering hands, the sailor pressed against the hole in the cabin boy's throat, a futile attempt to hold in the soul which had already left. Atao slowed down as he closed in, until he reached the deadly weapon which had caused this misery. With a loud tonk, the bucket dropped to the ground. In its stead, the warrior reached for the tool designed for killing. Asterisk much better. This will do nicely, asterisk alerted by the sounds right beside him, the frazzled sailor looked up at last. His tear-stained eyes burned themselves into Atao's brain. I didn't want that. You shoulda just dropped the damn bucket. In the end, the man was a wimp. Accident or not, he had provoked the catastrophe, and so he had to accept the consequences of his actions. Rather than answer the babbling buffoon, Atao just swung the saber. This time, he didn't need all those hits as he had with the bucket. This one was a much better weapon, and for the second time today it tasted blood. Even before the body had dropped to the floor, the warrior turned back to the 3 remaining sailors, the last traitors on the forecastle. By now, the front half of Atao's body had been colored red, while his back was still pristine, only wet from the spraying waves around them. The true sign of a warrior, he thought as he walked over to his last prey with slow, deliberate steps. Hey, wait, we give up. Toldo shouted. However, there was no reaction. By now, they were too far gone. If they ever wanted to end, revolutions needed a clean conclusion, and Atao was willing to oblige. Across the ship, the mutiny still raged. The traitors risked all of their lives, as they killed the men he had learned to call friends over the passing months. To him, these so-called foes were nothing. No training, no experience, no cultivation. He could mow them down like grass. It was exactly what he would do, cut down the weeds, down to the last. Chapter 17 3 Captains. You are listening at novelfull.audio. A partner to the winds around him, Atao swept across the deck, tipping the balance of each fight in favor of the defenders. As soon as the warrior got involved, none of the mutineers could even provide token resistance. Oh, there had been a few proper fighters aboard, men who had gone through pirate attacks, or had engaged in the ignoble trade themselves, and had the scars to prove it. However, even they were nothing but children before the sheer force of Atao's cultivated power. With a simple tackle of his shoulder, the warrior forced the large man before himself back onto the stairs to the quarterdeck. Winded from the impact and confused by the inhuman strength he had fallen victim to, the sailor took a few seconds to push himself back up. It was more than enough time for Atao to close in and bring down the bloody saber in his hand. In desperation, the man managed to bring his own weapon between Atao and his fragile body, but it wouldn't be enough. The force of the hit alone was enough to smash aside the enemy's blade, before Atao's weapon embedded itself deep in the mutineer's chest. As he removed his weapon, the warrior did his best to ignore the dying man's eyes. However, the sailor's rib cage was as tenacious as the sailor himself. Even as Atao increased his strength, the bones and muscle would not let go of the blade. Tormented by continuous strain, the cheap iron saber broke off, leaving a raw blade stuck inside of its last victim. Without remorse, the warrior dropped the broken handle. It was soon succeeded by the weapon the dead man had dropped just moments ago. No loyalty in a blade, Atao thought as he studied his new weapon, up and down. More of a short sword than a saber, but the pointy end would still work just the same. At last, with a weapon returned to his hand, the warrior turned to look over the results of his rampage. Even before he saw them, he could hear them in his ear. Screams of pain and desperation, from men who had been at the wrong end of a battle, for the first and last time in their lives. Lying here and there in puddles of blood, some in search of lost limbs, the mutineers showed the full extent of human misery. Shocked, lost and confused stood the survivors, sprinkled around what was left of the mutiny, without rhyme or reason. Most of the crew had been hit by total surprise and still had a hard time grasping the new roles of their former colleagues, but a few still knew what had to be done. The few men who were still alive, but too injured to save, received the coup de grace they had been hoping for. Finally, the entire main deck had been cleaned of vermin. Not one mutineer had been left alive. "Lower the sails," First Mate Atao shouted. At last, all eyes focused on the monster who had single-handedly decided the battle in their favor. In the eyes of the crewman, he could sense just as much fear as gratitude. "You got salt water in your ears. If we don't want to shatter on those cliffs around us, at least we should slow the ship down, right? Drifting is better than sinking. So get a move on you wimps, and cut those sails." At last, the first of the men moved, one of the brave ones who had relieved the final mutineers of their duties. Oren, Atau remembered. A loud and spirited "Aye" put the others out of their catatonic state as well, and soon, the men became preoccupied with work again, too busy to consider what had happened. With a short nod towards Atau, Oren spoke his silent acknowledgement of their temporary leader. His message made clear, he went over to another group of crewmen and began to talk in a spirited manner. However, none of it mattered to Atau. There was still work to be done up above. Just one more place, the warrior thought as he took the steps over the corpse and up to the quarterdeck. There, he would find the captain, and the ship steering. Whatever else was going on, they would have to get control of the Delalia back before the cliffs did irreversible damage to the ship. As he stepped up, he saw the full extent of the damage. The attackers had concentrated their betrayal here, to get swift power over the ship's controls and subvert the captain before anyone could interfere. With the captain's life in their hands, they would have had a much easier time getting their terms across, and it would have been far easier to force the crew into submission. However, their plans had gone wrong, horribly so. No one else on the ship would know, since Captain Rickert was not known for a hands-on approach, but as his first mate over the past 2 weeks, Atau had become privy to his secret. The captain, who had always been so disciplined and never fought anyone, was in fact a former knight, a cultivator himself. A man of honor and strength, who would never yield to such a cowardly attack. Thus, he found the quarterdeck in much the same state the main deck down below. The washing waves created streaky patterns in the red dot-coated floorboards, as men were begging for death, and given the grace by their former mates. However, here the battle had ended in favor of the mutineers. No matter how good a cultivator Rickert had been, the numbers on the quarterdeck had been far too unbalanced. Thus Atau found the captain, covered in streaks of red, with a saber in his side, leaned against the ship's stern. Though his always alert, emerald eyes aimed straight at his first mate, they had lost their sheen, staring into nothing, or into the world beyond. The captain was dead. Around him stood the ones at fault for this massacre, for this injustice. Old John, Polder and the rest of their gang of reverers. In the end, only half a dozen had survived the ferocious defense the captain had launched for his ship and crew. Even the ones left with their lives looked exhausted or injured. In the end, it was Atau's loud steps and his heavy breathing which alerted them to his presence. He wouldn't sneak up on them. There was no need. As low as any man can sink. "You've lost the right to call yourselves sailors," the warrior's heavy voice droned out. "What do you know, you big bastard? See that knife? I killed the captain. That means I'm the new boss now." Polder, all proud of himself, pointed to the corpse of Rickert, and to the saber stuck in his side. From the blade's angle, it was obvious that the final blow had been made from the back. "Coward, now what, big bastard?" Speechless. With a grin on his face, the mutineer picked up the mace before Rickert's feet. Atau had seen the crazy weapon before. 8 giant prongs of metal around a metal shaft, it was the captain's weapon of choice, which must have taken more than a few lives in its final fight with its master. Now, the captain's killer had picked up the captain's weapon, to show his own ambitions. In support, old John stepped forward as well. Of course the shrewd oldie would be fine after the battle. If nothing else, at least his age showed that he knew how to survive. The captain's dead, and we'll need someone to lead the ship through the currents and past the Cape. Who's gonna do that if not us? We got the most days at sea anyways. You're trying to fight us on this, you big bastard. Polder shouted out. Meanwhile, the other 4 surviving revirers rose as well and built themselves up behind their new captain, like a king's royal guard. It was an attempt to intimidate Atau, to make him submit under their crazy plan, but the warrior would never bow. He could feel the biting in his empty stomach, and the cramps in his legs. Though cultivation gave him strength beyond mortals, it drained his energy as well. He would have to end this soon. The first mate was ready to take on the last remnants of mutineers, when he heard steps come up the stairs in his back. Though there were foes right before him, Atau allowed himself a swift look over the shoulder, to reassess his position. Up the stairs came Oren, leading a group of crewmen with him. A total of 8 sailors had picked up weapons left from the slaughter on the main deck and followed him up to here. "Who are you kidding, you bastards? While you were trying to take over and got the whole ship in trouble, the big guy here did his best to save our asses. Why would I follow you on anything?" His head raised and his arms crossed, Oren built himself up beside Atau, ready to support the new leader he had chosen for himself. Like snow under the summer sun, Polder's confidence melted and was replaced by visible unease. With a frown, he looked over the superior numbers of his new enemies. At this point, he should consider his options, if trying to force his will was worth the risk. Atau, on the other hand, knew that the fight was very much over. Polder had lower numbers and the mood aboard the Delalia had tilted in Atau's favor. There was no reason to prolong the battle, really. They barely had enough people to operate the ship as was. Thus, he decided to make the decision easier for Polder. The tall warrior stepped forward, armed with a dangerous grin. "You know, where I come from, we don't solve these sorts of things by stabbing each other in the back. We fight it out in a duel, one-on-one, like real men. You say you killed the captain, right? Well, in that case, all I have to do is kill you, huh? How about this? We fight it out right here, man on man. Let the greater warrior prevail and lead the ship and crew to safety." Polder's beady eyes rolled in their sockets as he calculated his chances. Of course, the sailor was terrible at math, so he soon managed to reach the wrong conclusion. "All right, I'm in," Polder said, as he swung the captain's giant mace in the air. "I'll teach you all what happens if you don't follow my commands. Come here, you fat bastard, and let me break your thick skull." With a smirk, Atau looked behind the fake captain, over to old John. The survival expert had realized that Polder was being full of himself, as he usually was. He tried to hold back the moron, grab his shoulder, but John's old body slowed his actions. Before he could even get close to Polder, the new captain had already charged at the old first mate. Another wild charge, like Atau had seen so many of over the course of the battle. Rather than charge himself, the warrior improved his stance as he waited for the eager captain to come to him. He knew that the mace wasn't Polder's weapon. He also knew that it would be the sailor's undoing. In the end, the whole affair took mere moments to complete, only a single step forward at the right moment. Overwhelmed by the weight of the weapon, Polder failed to even finish his swing by the time he collided with Atau. While the mace's handle weakly collided with Atau's side, the warrior grabbed the traitor's collar and pushed him to the ground. No technique or finesse was required, only strength. Once his back hit the boards, Polder got the mace between himself and the superhuman warrior. "Stay away, you beast," he shouted, as he limply swung the weapon in front of his nose. In response, the warrior grabbed the mace's handle near the head and pulled. With one simple movement, he had disarmed the fake captain. A cultivator against a mortal. This had never been a fair fight. No, he wouldn't even let the traitor beg for his life. With a swift hit from the stolen weapon, Atau crushed the bastard's face. Now, not even his parents would recognize his corpse. It was exactly what the beast deserved. As the warrior raised his body again, Atau looked towards the final revirers on deck, who had huddled together, their eyes transfixed by Atau's ruthless actions, terrified. "Anyone else got a problem with me calling the shots?" the warrior shouted out into the rigging. "No, Captain," he heard Oren's voice again, who took the chance to confer Atau his new title. Soon, the shouts of other sailors followed. There was not a single voice of dissent. Confused, the new captain stared down onto the mace in his hands, the weapon every captain of the Dalalia had carried, all three of them. "Captain Atau," he heard from behind himself. He turned and saw Oren close in. "What do we do with the mutineers?" With a nod of his head, Oren gestured towards the 5 remaining revealers, old John among them. Atau thought for a second. Taking them out right here would be the cleanest solution. However, the men in question still had been comrades to the crew for many months, and in some cases years. Killing them in cold blood could send a dangerous first signal to his new crew. Still, he couldn't just keep them around. No matter what, the revealers had to go. Put them on a dinghy and set them free. Let the currents judge them. With a deep voice, Atau looked at old John, the man who had taught him his craft more than anyone else. He tried to find a trace of comfort reflected in his eyes, maybe remorse, maybe regret. However, all he could see was bitter hatred. "Oren, from now on, you're my first mate. Keep the ship steady and send some men under deck to assess the damage to the hull. I'll see to our next course." His orders given, Atau left the upper deck to disappear into the captain's quarters. He would have to check the maps and try to get them through the current somehow. Responsible for the remaining souls on board, ship leaking and under strength, it was a challenge he was less than ready for. Chapter 18 New Era. You are listening at novelfull.audio. No, look. There's not that many vowels. Only 15. There's also not that many symbols in total, pretty close to your own script. It's not excessive if I ask you to memorize a handful of symbols, right? It's really just memorization, and then the rest is nothing but listening for the right sounds. Frustrated, Korko tried his hardest to keep a calm voice while he explained his new writing system to the most recent batch of students. "But Master Korko, why do we need to learn these? We already know how to read language. Why would we ever need any letters besides veteran?" Just as he had been taught, one of the newly hired fast-grade merchants raised his hand before he asked his question, though the question itself was as ridiculous as the one his classmates had asked before. In total, there were 17 in this room, studying the scripture Korko had invented, built from the phonetic alphabet in his head. All of them had doubts about accepting his teachings. It really was tiring, but from Korko's experience, the first session always was the hardest. "Okay, back to the beginning. I'm sure you've heard from your colleagues about some of the stuff I've been teaching, like interest rate calculations or modal logic." All the men nodded their heads with vigor, like good students. Of course they had heard. As far as Korko understood, it was the only reason they were here and listening to a merchant's lecture. All of his teachings were voluntary, so he had needed a compelling reason for them to listen to a stranger without formal university training. Still, even when he first offered his wisdom to his employees, at least a few had been more than ready to learn, in this continent in which knowledge was a rare and special privilege. It hadn't taken long for the first students to show off their new knowledge in front of others. The result was a chain reaction. Soon, his classrooms had been filled with students willing to accept his conditions. In the end, he had to expand his classes. Whenever he wasn't busy going over the company books or writing down new knowledge, he would be in here, imparting wisdom and getting his men ready for their great purpose. "Alright, since everyone here wants to learn what I have to teach, you should also understand the contract you enter when you do so. I will teach you advanced mathematics, natural laws, grammar and logic. However, the books which store this knowledge are not written in any Arcavian language or scripture. This script is exclusive to the Medalla Empire across the Weltalic Sea. At this point, it is no secret inside the company that I wasn't born in Arcavia. Once I return home, and I will return home, I expect you to follow along and support my endeavors there, for no less than 5 years. That is my condition for imparting my teachings. If you want to be of any help in a foreign country, you will need to know both the local language and the script. Now you will either accept my terms and learn everything I have to teach you, or you can leave right now. I understand that the prospect of leaving home to a far-off land is scary and that some of you might have family. Thus, I won't fire or disadvantage anyone for that choice, that I will guarantee. As he tried to suppress his worries, Korko's look swerved over the 17 new students who sat before him, paper and feather quill in their hands. In fact, he hadn't told the full truth in his lectures, especially when it came to the letters he had introduced. They were, in fact, not something any scholar in Medalla had ever seen. However, once he returned home, Korko, the crown prince, would take over the empire. If he wanted to introduce concepts like universal compulsory education, it would be necessary to get rid of the complicated letters of the upper classes. There was a strong class divide within Medalla, with the two upper classes far removed from the lowly commoners at the bottom. This reflected in the letters used by nobility as well. The Medallan script of Yakua had been designed in a convoluted fashion to exclude the common folk from knowledge, something Korko was determined to change. Plus, he wouldn't pass up the chance to fix his country's messed up orthography. Replacing the myriad of pictographic symbols for a mere 50.1 letters would be a godsend, even more so since they encompassed all phonetic sounds their language had to offer. They were perfectly simple to learn and perfectly simple to use. As an added bonus, they would also be much easier to handle on a printing press, another important innovation he intended to bring across the sea. While it was already wide-spread in Arcavia, the countless letters of Medalla would be a terrible fit for the presses and hinder their proliferation. Just as Korko set off to continue the lecture on his new Yakua script, a small gong went off to halt the teacher in his tracks. Sounding out beside him was a complex construction of gears and springs. The clever automaton was a mechanical clock, something he had been delighted to find present in Arcavia as well. Though the clock was primitive and a bit imprecise, its mere existence would save him much time and trouble. It also showed how far Medalla was behind the Arcavians in terms of technology, something else he would have to remedy. Crown Prince Korko was sure that his return would signal a new era for his people. Although in this instance, the gong had no such lofty meaning. Instead, it signaled the end of their session. Okay, class dismissed. Until tomorrow, learn the 50.1 characters, properly this time. We can't get anywhere without the basics and I won't answer pointless questions for another hour. Under the rustling of paper and clothes, his students packed up their things and, one by one, left the room. As his eyes followed them to the exit, Korko found his cousin Atao, his shoulder leaned against the entrance. Comfortable as he was, it appeared he had been waiting for a while. Now spotted, Atao pushed himself off and walked towards Korko. Hey boss, class is going well. Somewhat. You're still keeping up with the others. Korko answered as he sorted through his own papers. Yeah. I haven't slacked off at sea, been reading all the books you had me bring. Armed with a fleet and loyal troops, plus all that knowledge in tow. I'll enjoy our father's baffled faces once we get back home. Korko answered with nothing but a simple grin as he dropped the papers into their drawer, before he stood to welcome his cousin back home with a proper hug. They had both gone through similar circumstances, so the crown prince very much shared Atao's sentiment. Both of them had been sent across the sea by their fathers, both to avoid trouble in the succession of their respective houses. Just the same as Korko, Atao was determined to return home with honors, to show his father just how wrong he had been to push him away. When did you get back? No further words were needed on the subject, so Korko switched topics. He still didn't know why Atao was seeking him out straight after his arrival. Just now, really. The crew's still unpacking the ship, so how did it go? Does the ship sail well? With a grin, Atao looked out of the window, towards the nearby harbor. The homeward's a great piece of work. After the disaster last time, this journey's been a drizzle to a storm. Still. Soon, his grin transformed into a look of worry, eyebrows pinched together. Still what? You're not telling me that there's something wrong with the ship, not after we've paid so much for the thing. Korko could already feel himself get annoyed over the sloppy shipwrights. No, it's not that. The biggest problem is the situation in the Weltalic Sea itself, really. On our way back home we came across some Bornish ships, hell-bent on stopping us dead in our tracks. Atau sat on one of the student tables as he spoke. They'd attack a neutral vessel. So then what? So, the Homeward is the fastest ship I've ever been on. With that slim profile of ours they'd never catch us in the wind. Still, Whiteport and Borna have been getting more and more at odds. You can see that all across the western coastlines. Let's hope Whiteport smashes their fleet soon. If the Bornish get control of the southwestern coast, that's gonna spell almost certain doom for us. At that point, we're gonna have to be more than just quick if we don't want to get screwed. It's worse than that, Korko added. You might not believe this, but there's no way Whiteport's antiquated fleet could actually stand up to the Bornish. For now, all that's keeping them alive is the lack of confidence the Borna side have in their new navy. Their ships with sails and cannons are largely untested, but believe me that they're far beyond the wooden vessels. Once Whiteport forces a fight, they might lose control of the entire Western Sea. In that case, let's just hope the Witten aren't being stupid. Korko thought back to the great King Albius of Whiteport, the man who had so adamantly believed in his quack doctor and had swallowed Korko's lies just the same. Maybe we should get ourselves armed, just in case. If the Bornish free up their hands, Etra is gonna be their first target, Duke Herak or not. Let's not leave this one in the hands of fate. A storm was brewing to the west. They had to prepare now, before their new home would be blown away by the winds of change. Underscore 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 underscore. The heart swelled, ballooned up by purest pride. Alric looked at the results of his bravery. All around them floated pieces of splintered driftwood, leftovers of the greatest fleet Western Arcavia had ever seen. In the distance, he could still hear the thunderous roar of cannon fire as his ships pursued the final remnants of Footlicker scum. Despite the stiff breeze which had served them so well in the battle, their great flagship would not take part in the cleanup. A look-up showed Alric the simple reason. Once they had understood their inevitable fate, the enemy had charged them in one final, desperate attack, hoping beyond hope to take the Bornish capital ship with them. Of course the Footlickers with their outdated style of combat could do no harm to their modern vessel, but their consistent arrow fire had still turned their mainsail into a termite's nest. With all those holes, they would have to patch or replace it before they could call themselves seaworthy again. Thus, they had been denied the great honor of leading the final battle. Still, it wouldn't change the outcome. If he was honest, and of course this wasn't something he would ever admit to anyone, he had been more than worried when the Whiteport fleet had forced them into a corner. After all, behind them stood centuries of proud tradition, of naval dominance, something their numbers very much reflected. An impressive 500 ships, a god-third of the notorious Whiteport navy, up against no more than 60 Bornish vessels. It seemed like an impossible task, like a young tree before an avalanche. Thus, Admiral Alric had ordered retreat, out towards the open sea. Like all the times before, he had expected the Whiteport ships to retreat as well. So far, they had settled for little scares to prove their dominance to the other lordships of the continent. However, this time the Whiteport fleet had shown much more bite. It seemed as if the Footlickers had finally been angered enough by the Bornish conversion to the great revering church. As a result, his fleet had been driven out, away from the coast and out into the rough waves of the open sea. Sailing out in the eternal blue, without any land to navigate by, was a challenge even under the best of conditions. Moreover, the admiral had never packed the relevant sea maps to travel this far off the coast. He didn't even know if the Bornish Admiralty had sea maps like that. At least Alric had never seen any. Thus, boxed in by the blue hell in front and the white hell behind, the desperate admiral had ordered the engagement, to break through and escape back into Bournish waters. At first, his men had been desperate, cursing their fate as they were whipped to order, but they changed their tune soon after the first salvo of cannon fire. In the end, it was a war like none they had ever seen. The mighty Whiteport Navy had been helpless as the heavy iron balls had burst through their rudders, splintered apart their hulls. While their ships had stalled one by one, sinking or immobile, they had blocked the path for the rest of their onrushing fleet. Meanwhile, Auric's own vessels had flown on the wind of the high seas, as if they had been given wings. This must have been how the Arcavian knights of years past had felt when they had invaded the Shermone deserts, as the mounted archers of the heathens had run circles around them. No way forward and no way back, no future and no hope. It was a total massacre. Auric could only imagine the fear their opponents must have felt in their final moments. However, there was no time for compassion, not now that history was calling him. Now that the battle was over, Whiteport's grasp on the western coast had ended, the fire of the cannons rang in a new era of Bournish dominion over the Weltalic Sea. It would also be the death knell for the old-fashioned galleys and boarding parties which had given Whiteport all their power in the past. The future belonged to the deafening thunder of cannon fire, of this Auric was sure. With a look over his busy deck, the admiral observed his batteries of 3-pounders, which had so expertly dismantled the enemy's rudders, before they swerved to the 3 massive 6-pound cannons which had even pierced the foe's hulls, causing deaths hitherto unheard of in naval combat. At last, Borna had survived the Wittian crisis. At last, they could stand proud, free to fight the unbelieving North, free to usher in a new era on land just as they had done at sea. Chapter 19 A Man of Few Words. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Howling winds surrounded the caravan all around, signs of an oncoming storm. Though he was no native, Fidelio had been in Ettra long enough to understand the signs of nature around these parts. His worried look went up, into the black sky. The lack of stars told him of the clouds which had spread themselves all over. Although he could not see them, they still pressed themselves on the atmosphere, and his mood with it. With the sky covered as well, they were surrounded by deepest blackness on all sides, the dark driven out by nothing more than a handful of torches and lanterns stretched along their row of donkey carts. He remembered Corco's words during one of his lectures, speaking of distant cities, illuminated bright as day throughout the night. In his current position, he found the story hard to believe, but of course he knew better than to doubt his prescient master. Still, surrounded by invisible enemies, his unease grew with every step. The darkness had tried its hardest to sap his spirit and it appeared he was not alone in the notion. Why were we not taking a break then? The men and donkeys are tired, and there's a storm brewing. Wild beasts will come as well. We'll only take longer once the animals get injured in an attack. Panting, Brocart shouted in Fidelio's ear, in an attempt to overpower the howling wind. Erratic swivels of his head scanned the surroundings and betrayed his worries. No time, Fidelio answered. If he had been so inclined, he could have explained, in detail, how most animals would seek shelter before a storm instead of look for an attack, how his scenario was unreasonable. Just the same, he could have explained to Brocart the gravity of their position and the importance of their task, but found that no fancy words would make a lick of difference. Over the passing months, Fidelio had learned that oftentimes, only few words were needed. No, there is. I know of a copse not far from here. There's a hunter's lodge large enough to fit all the men. We can find shelter there, and build an overhang for the animals, just before the rain hits us. We need to get back to Ettra. Stoic, the warrior stared ahead, into the western darkness. I get it, boss, we'll need the extra food and those new fangled guns for when the Bornish show up, but it's gonna be trouble either way. At this speed, we're not gonna reach Ettra until sunrise, even if nothing bad happens. Plus, the powder's gonna be useless anyways if it ends up getting wet. True to himself, Fidelio just nodded his head in understanding. Brokart's words made some sense, but he wouldn't give the man an inch, not unless he had to. Unfortunately, by now his arguments sounded quite convincing to the men around, so it seemed as if he would be forced to pay attention or risk more discontent within their group. What good are those toys anyways? Even if we use them, those soft little balls won't get through a real knight's armor. One charge from a line of knights and our craftsmen will break apart like a bottle under a hammer. Since the things aren't gonna do much good either way, why force the men and beasts to death with a rush like this? Another man had spoken up, from his other side. This one Fidelio didn't know the name of, but he understood that the man was one of the people Brokart had brought into their little group with him. The entire operation had been put together in great haste. After Atau had come back from his last trip, Korko had asked Fidelio to get a group of men together, reach all the way to Gania and buy all the finished matchlock rifles they had ordered from there a while back, plus additional food for their granary to prepare for an oncoming siege. The warrior himself didn't think much of these so-called firearms. Over the past years, they had proven useful in routing levied troops, since the loud noise and invisible death would strike fear into the hearts of common soldiers, but a proper, trained army of warriors would always win out against them. Even if the bullets could pierce the outer layer of armor, they would rarely do lasting damage to the charging knights. Still, he had learned to trust his master and so had accepted the command without question. Loyalty was a virtue his father had taught him to value above all others, but even more so, the crown prince had proven his talent and tenacity on more than one occasion over the past several years. Whatever path Korko thought was the most prudent to take, Fidelio would follow along. Of course, the men present would know this as well, even the ones who had been buzzing around him ever since they had left Gania with their haul in tow. They were paid for carrying, not for giving advice, and yet they had been insisting on course corrections, or on secret hideouts. Maybe it was time to take their advice, Fidelio thought as he suppressed a smile on his face. Halt! With his torch lifted high above his head, Fidelio slowed down. The warrior's loud voice resounded all across their caravan and all the men reacted as ordered, until even the very last at the back had stood still. No matter how annoying some of them were, at least they showed due respect for the giant warrior who led them. Everyone gather together. Under confused murmurs, the tired men collected themselves in a large clump, focused on their leader's next words. With them, the shine of the torches retracted and balled like a fist, collecting before the warrior. Once enough light had been collected to see every man's face, Fidelio's fist landed on the heavy cart behind him, the one which had transported all those precious, important guns. Right away, all chatter stopped. Many of the carriers here had worked with Fidelio before, and even the ones who hadn't knew of his reputation. After all, it was hard for a man of his appearance to not be the subject of a few rumors. What they would know of him was that he valued order, discipline, honor and strength, and was himself a living embodiment of all these qualities. Of course, they also knew that he was a wrathful simpleton, an impression Fidelio wasn't eager to change. Thus, chatting out of line would cause the kind of trouble every man here would want to avoid. The audience silenced, the warrior started his play. All of you guys should know, but some here look unsure, so I'll repeat our mission again. Whiteport lost the war, so the greedy Bornish are gonna come to Etra, just like they tried some 10 years back. We gotta deal with that. For that we need the weapons we bought in Gania. But that's no good if we don't make it back home in time. Now, Brokart here has said some good stuff. It's dangerous to keep going. It's night, it's gonna rain soon and he and his mates know a copse we can hide out in to get away from the Bornish scouts. With great care, Fidelio's eyes ran over all the faces before him, illuminated by the flickering light of countless little fires. He saw all kinds of emotions reflected in their faces. Spotting a pattern would be hard like this. Just as we left Gania, we got ambushed, you remember that. In the middle of the night, the Bornish scouts came to attack, to take our weapons and supplies, the food for your families. To lure them away, we had to leave behind some good men. Only cause of them could we make a run for it. Since then, we've been on the move, and the hard march has been difficult on all of us. Fidelio thought back to Ulf, one of the earliest workers for the fast grade company and the other loyal men who had been absent since yesterday's incident. The time since last night had been harsh on all of them, but never would Fidelio trade position with those brave souls. Now Burkhard here says that the hut inside the copse is safe, that it's hidden. That's fine, but there's no proving it. In the end, we'll have to decide. Do we try our luck in the woods and risk the Bornish catching us or sieging the city before we get there, or do we keep going and risk wet and useless powder? For a while, silence dominated the clearing, until one of the men spoke up. Why ask us? Wouldn't you just decide this yourself, boss? Last night, and all the way until today, all of you have shown your spirit, far beyond ordinary men. In my eyes, you are now warriors, true men I will respect. I cannot force warriors to heed my command blindly. That's why I'll leave the decision up to you. Burkhard, get over there, to the side of the caravan. Fidelio pointed towards the cliff face a few feet away, just close enough for it to peek out of the darkness. With a sneer, Burkhard followed the warrior's command for the last time. The warrior knew what the traitor was thinking. That he had won, that he had tricked him. However, through the flickering lights, he failed to notice Fidelio's own derisive grin. Any man who believes that Burkhardt's idea is right, that we should seek shelter in the woods, follows him over there. Any man who believes we should keep our current course to defend the city, at any price, stay here with me. All right guys, let's go. A spirited Burkhard clapped his hands together. Once again, the murmur started up as the carriers began to move. Annoyed, Fidelio watched as the men began to group themselves. Soon, they had gotten into formation, and the numbers were alarming. Over half of the remaining men had decided to step away from the caravan, and towards the cliffs. Worse than I thought. Of course he had known that there had been some level of infiltration, and that he wasn't all too popular with the reverers, but this was too much to bear. In the end, without the loyal fast-grade men who had been missing since last night, his own no longer was the loudest voice in their group. It spelled trouble for the oncoming siege, but at least for tonight he could salvage the situation. Is that everyone? Fidelio shouted, his voice clear and steady over the winds. He wouldn't even consider counting heads. There was no need. Yeah, Burkhard shouted back, his voice almost swallowed by the wailing cliffs. Looks like the men have decided. We'll need to move into the copse now before the storm breaks. Last chance. Anyone want to change their minds? Does the idea of hiding out while our friends and family back home are under attack not strike any here as cowardice? We're just being careful. No need to risk the city for undue haste, the traitor replied with a frown, clearly annoyed at Fidelio's insistence. You wanna accept the decision of those warriors you respect so much, or are you gonna play tyrant with us? With a smile, Fidelio nodded his head. By now, the last of his reservations had disappeared. At arms. Above the carts in Fidelio's back, the loud shout caused the blankets to raise up. From within appeared a good dozen men, all armed with their shiny, new matchlock guns, lutes lit and ready to fire. Wait, what is this? Burkhard shouted in confusion. It seems like you don't hold the majority anymore, returned the same calm voice as before. Who are those soldiers? You've brought us out here to kill us. I knew it, you're just a footlicker bastard who wants to kill all the pious reverers of Etra. The traitor's shoddy attempts to instigate the carriers fell on deaf ears. None of them would be brave enough to act. After all, they were no warriors. Burkhard, back in Gania, I had some men follow you. We saw you contact the Bornish spies, tell them about our plans. Tell them when we'd leave the city, where to set their ambush. In response to the revelation, the traitor's face turned as white as gnawed off bone under the moonlight. Lies. I did no such things. The shrill tone helped Burkhard get heard over the weather, if nothing else. The men behind me are proof. You don't recognize them. Hey, Borkart. So you turned traitor, huh? Not that I'm surprised. How much coin was Etra worth? How much did you sell us for? A third voice entered the talks. It had come from Ulf, one of the armed men behind Fidelio. Ulf, confused, Borkart looked over into the darkness behind the Tau, towards the fireflies of loots which could spell his doom at any moment. We thought you were killed by the Bornish scouts. How did you survive? When the attack happened, the scouts were long dead. They were exactly where you told them to be, and they never saw us coming. Boss made sure of that, Ulf sneered. We've been hidden ever since we ran after the fake scouts. To lure out you, and your whole gang of traitors. You. With greater understanding, Borkart's eyes grew larger as well, as he pointed to Fidelio in accusation. You tricked us. Like I said, it was all a ploy to kill us. The Great Seer foresaw all that would happen here. We have been ready from the moment we left Etra. Ulf answered instead of his boss, but Fidelio wouldn't bother to correct him. Of course Corco had foreseen none of this. As many talents as his master had, he couldn't see the future. Still, Fidelio would be foolish to admit that it had been his own deductions and plans which had led them all here. Being taken lightly had been far too useful in the past and would be far more useful in the future as well. So that's it, you big lunk of meat, huh? Despondent, Borkart's finger still judged Fidelio's own treachery. It was all he could do. A look around had revealed the full, devilish extent of their position. The cliffs had been hidden in the dark at first, but now that their torches had come closer, he saw that they trapped him and his men on three sides. The only path in front was blocked by armed foes. Thus, Borkart went for a last, desperate attempt. You're just gonna gun us down here, unarmed men. Even if you're right, how do you know who's a traitor and who's not? Almost all the guys here were convinced by me only just now, they didn't know. I thought we were warriors. Don't warriors deserve a death better than this? You're no warriors, Atau replied with ice in his voice. Even if you were, it wouldn't change a thing. Of course the cowards who had chosen their safety over the freedom of their city had no honor and wouldn't deserve to be called anything other than vermin. Even more, if they had been warriors, he would kill them all the same. Back in Etra, the crown prince would be up throughout the night to prepare for the defense of their city, their home. He wouldn't let any harm come to his master, to Metala's next great ruler. It was what he had sworn to his father before they had left the island, and even more so, it was what he had decided for himself. Though he knew Corco wouldn't approve of this sort of execution, call it barbaric, inhumane and honorless, not even his master's thoughts would sway the warrior. He would throw it away, honor, reputation and all, to defend the crown prince with his life. Thus, there was only one choice Fidelio could make. Fire. Oftentimes, only few words were needed. Chapter 20 Faith and Greed. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Corco could already smell, and hear, the bullshit long before he reached the door to the Great Hall of the Merchants' Union. So where's this great seer now? Where is his respect towards this hallowed hall? Maybe the charlatan has seen that the merchants of Etra will no longer fall for his scams and the coward has decided to run before he is unmasked. Corco knew the voice well and, with a thought back to the man's habitual, shameless sneer, he considered just turning around and leaving them to their own devices. Still, he had to do what had to be done, even if he was forced to save a few assholes in the process. No entry, the militiaman said with pretended strength in his voice, flustered at Corco's aggressive posture and swift movements. Clearly, the guard of the Merchants' Union wasn't a cultivator, but instead a simple man recruited from one of the city's craftsmen's guilds. Although Etra, as a free city, didn't have any knights at their disposal, at least they could have splurged on a few decent mercenaries. If nothing else, we should consider the offer that was made by Master Fastgrade. It is free ware, after all. Another unpleasant voice reached Corco from beyond the door, but at least this one didn't make his blood boil over. As an answer to the guard's order, the prince shoved the man to the side. Flustered as he was, the militiaman didn't even have the presence of mind to draw his cheap sword. With this level of ability, trying to hold off the Bornish armies was laughable. It would be up to the fast-grade company to organize the mob and give them a fighting chance. The cheap wooden door blew open from Korko's kick and revealed the self-possessed old men inside. With the densely packed, high-backrest chairs, set up in two opposing rows, the arrangement reminded Korko a bit of a claustrophobic version of the British Parliament in his memories. The Great Hall of Etre was, on any other day, a place of arbitration between merchant houses. Today, however, all members of Etre's union had collected here to debate on the upcoming crisis. Rather, they should have talked about the incoming Bornish attack, but were instead stuck on trying to denounce their newest member. All of that had been interrupted by the denounced, by Korko's entry. Standing in the center, between the rows of seats, a large man with a tiny nose turned to face Korko, now that his accusations had been interrupted. "Who are you calling a coward, Trelban?" Though he was surprised at first, Trelban's dull look of confusion soon made way for his faked, off-brand anger. "Oh, it seems the great seer has found his heart at last. I wonder, why else but for fear would the seer of the lordships appear only now, when he was the one to call the meeting in the first place?" "Traffic jam," Korko answered in a dry tone. "Ha! I had some stuff to get first, to make sure this meeting doesn't get out of hand. There's too much at stake to risk the bullshitters getting away." Rather than explain his own personal joke, Korko pointed to Brym, who had silently followed the prince along on his storm of the Great Hall. Now called upon, the youngster raised the heavy leather bag he held in his hand, filled with wonders. "In that case, I believe we should continue." A voice came from the left. Korko looked up ahead and found Devarder sit among his peers, giving the prince a cold look. Since Atau's last journey on a Devarder ship, the relationship between Fastgrade and Devarder had considerably soured. Not only had they failed to deliver the goods and return the money, no. By the time the ship had made its way back to Etre, it was practically totaled. However, trouble over the damages was the least of their concerns. In the end, all those problems didn't even begin to match up to the dead Captain Rickard, a man who had been close to Devarder for many years. Even though reports from the crew showed that Atau couldn't be faulted for the incident, Devarder never seemed fully convinced. In the end, they came to an agreement and smoothed out their differences, but for now, their relationship was strictly limited to business, with the old merchant trying visibly to distance himself from the fast-grade people. Korko could feel their space inside Etre shrinking, as more and more merchants decided to stand against them. Still, at least the old archivists would stand on his side, at least so long as the revirers inside the hall remained the threat to Etre's order they had been in recent months. "I agree with the speaker. Let us answer the relevant questions, one at a time, now that all parties are present," Trelban added. Meanwhile, Korko took his seat within the assembly, with Brym taking a stand by his side. After his first few meetings, the prince had mostly stayed away from the dry discussions. He really couldn't stand the greed and pettiness the merchants would show towards each other, and even more so towards outsiders. This sort of morally bankrupt behavior was something he was determined to root out. Let the values of enlightenment rule over the countries of the earth, that was his noble goal. Unaware of the grand ambitions before him, Trelban continued with his selfish speech, fueled by greed. "Now then, if the speaker may. Before all else, I believe it would be dangerous to let these weapons inside our fair city, even more so weapons which are so firmly owned by a single personage, namely Master Fastgrade, as he is suspect already. A servant to the northern lordships, he could turn against the people of Etre with but a simple order from his northern lords." Loud complaints rose from the left, from the archivists around Devarder, while Trelban's revirers clapped in accord. "You're saying that with all those guns I'd try to, conquer the city, slack?" Jawed, Korko stared at Trelban. He had been prepared for a lot, but he really couldn't believe the Slimeball's newest achievements in nonsense. What else could all those weapons be for, enough to arm a private force? The guns are to protect the city and they're not going to my people alone. We've brought over 100, so where are all these loyal soldiers gonna come from? I don't even have that many permanent workers, even if I include all the chicken-breasted accountants who couldn't tell apart a barrel from a butt. The guns are to arm the guild militias of Etra, to help them defend our city in time of crisis. Trelban only scoffed in response, arms crossed. Consequences be damned, Korko really felt like slapping that smirk off of his punchable face. The brave men of Etra need no improper weapons for defense. We were more than capable of defense 10 years ago, so what would have changed now? Moreover, any weapons brought into Etra would break the agreement and provoke Borna. Clearly, the traitor intends to get the gunpowder into our city to start some fires, consequences be damned. Maybe this way, he can force us to pay for his ludicrous firefighters. Under loud clatter, Korko's seat slid back as he got up with force. He ignored the worried look of Brym to his side and marched straight to the sleazy merchant. Did you just call me a traitor, you greedy piece of shit? His lower jaw jutted out, the prince stomped towards the retreating merchant, eyes fixed on his target alone. From the edge of the room arrived another guard, in time to stop the young union member from harming his colleague. However, Korko wouldn't play along. As the militiaman came to push Korko back by the chest, the crown prince only needed one step to the side to decide the fight. With a quick grab onto the so-called guard's poorly fitted gambeson, Korko pulled the man's torso over his own leg and forced the guard to the ground. To the deafening silence of the audience, Korko looked up from his victim and gazed over to his accuser. Brave men of Etra, was it? Look at their equipment, at their shape. They're fucking useless, nowhere near the men who, barely, defended this city in the past. Not to mention, back then, Etra had the full support of the free cities of the south. With your reverer bullshit causing fights everywhere, everyone else is busy. We'll have to defend us ourselves this time. As Korko began to march again, Trelban retreated further. In the end, his careless feet collided with an empty chair and, under great clatter, both man and seat fell to the lavish marble floor. You speak of us, yet you are nothing but an outsider. You cannot pretend to be one of us, traitor, the reverer squeaked as he looked back up to Korko. You're right, the outsider replied with a confident grin. Unlike you, I wasn't born here. You know what makes you a citizen of Etra? Random chance, a throw of the dice. You did nothing to join the city, your mother did all the work. I'm different. I've traveled all across Arcavia, seen the halls of kings and queens. Among all the great places, all the marvels I have seen along my journey, I've chosen this one, and no other, to call home. Now tell me, which one of us will stand for the city when it counts? You accused me of profiteering. Well, I'll tell you that I won't charge anyone for those guns, or for the food that's still waiting outside the walls with them. I won't even charge for fire safety as long as a siege is going. Wanna know why? It's because I have chosen Etra as my home, as the place I will defend with my life. From behind him, from the stands, he could hear intermittent claps, which soon turned into roaring applause. It felt as if he was on the cusp of winning over the crowd, as if he would become a proper part of the union again. However, the prince was still focused on the floored bullshitter right before him. From his rolling eyes, he could see that Trelban hadn't given up yet. The slime ball was still looking for a way out. So what, talking big is easy. Who knows if there even will be a siege? There is no indication that the Bornish will attack anyone, let alone us. They are adherents to the true faith, even their king is a converted reverer now. They have no reason to attack a pious city. With a harmless smile, Korko stared down onto the sunken puddle of slime. Unlike the ridiculous claim of a coup, the prince had expected the faith argument, so he had prepared in advance. Brym, he shouted across the room. Here, big bro. A startled voice answered right by his side. Korko turned to see that the young merchant had already left his seat and was now holding the open bag towards Korko's face, for him to retrieve the contents. Unperturbed by his own error, the merchant prince grabbed inside and, with a metallic clang, threw Exhibit A to Trelban's feet. "What is this?" the slimy merchant asked as he picked up the iron helmet with the flat top. "You were around 10 years ago, O great son of Etra, so you should remember this shape well. It's a Bornish helmet. On the way back from Gania, my convoy was attacked by a Bornish scouting unit, ready to intercept the city supplies. They were supported by traders within, revirers who had been bought over by the Bornish Duke Herak. Korko wouldn't argue over whether or not Etra was a revirer city. That path would only lead to more pointless arguments. Instead, he focused on facts. "Pa." Trelban spat on the ground next to him. "That helmet could come from anywhere. Telling tall tales is easy enough. Why would the Bornish attack their brethren in faith?" Again, Korko reached inside his bag of many things for an answer. This time, he retrieved a rolled-up scroll of paper and threw it to the merchant's feet, just the same as the helmet. "Here's proof. A retelling of the happenings around Gania, signed by every man present. If you still don't believe me, you can ask them yourselves. Many of those carriers and day workers have done various jobs for various people in this room. You know as well as me that they're not all related to me. And stop trying to make this about faith. It's not. As always, it's just simple greed. The Bornish were archivists like Etra when they attacked back then, so why would they change tune now?" Defeated, the slime sank even deeper into the cold marbled floor. He wouldn't even pick up the letter to check the proof. There was no need. Korko believed the debate over, but another merchant realized the problem with his reasoning. "Wait, if the caravan has been denied entry, then how did the helmet and letter even make their way inside?" The shocked voice from the ranks in his front was answered by Korko's confident grin. "It's smuggled, of course. So much for the great guards of Etra. Getting something illegal inside the walls is easy, as many in this room should well know. That's the problem with a city of merchants, everything's for sale. Even when we carried supplies, the Bornish got our exact cargo en route from one of our own, a true son of the city, who sold us out for a handful of coins. Now I don't know what plans you have, or how many of you brave revirers have readied their ships to flee once the enemy appears, or how many have struck backroom deals with the Bornish. Frankly, I don't care. This is my home. I have chosen it as mine and I won't hand it over to some greedy bastards, inside or out. No matter what, you can't prevent those guns from entering Etra. And once the guns are inside, you won't get the gates to open in secret when the Bornish come. So you best make a wise choice today, or those guns will aim inside before they aim over the walls. I can tolerate much, but I will not allow traitors, no matter what. Etra is my home, and I will defend it to the last, with or against you." Korko's powerful baritone lingered throughout the chamber, without reply. The prince's look glanced past the rows of merchants one last time, before he turned and left the hall, unopposed. He knew they would make the right decision today. Their lives depended on it.